several months should they need it. But it does depend what countries decide in terms of interest rates. There's lots to be clarified. They've got past the main hurdle, I think. What will happen next week? EU leaders will meet, not face-to-face, screen-to-screen. They'll be on a virtual chat room, not Zoom, I'm told. It's not secure enough for governments. But they will endorse what's happened today, and then we'll look to work out what they call this now dead term, Corona bonds. Can the French, they seem to have a compromise, can they go for a French idea of some kind of way forward to kind of share mutual debt? Again, it's in the early days.
Gavin, thank you very much for joining me.
And thank you, Philip Hampshire, for that business report. Now, have a listen to this. If that composition sounds dreamy or makes you feel a little sleepy,
Several months should they need
because
it.
it's an
But
extract
again,
of Sleep
it
by
does depend
composer Max Richter.
what countries
It's an
decide in terms of
8-hour
interest
piece of
rates. There's
music,
lots to be clarified. They've got
which
past the main
was
hurdle, I
recorded by
think.
the BBC
What will
5
happen
years
next
ago, and
week?
which has
EU
been
leaders
performed
will
around the
meet,
world to
not
audiences
face-to-face, screen-to-screen.
who
They'll
were
be on
given
a
beds
virtual chat room,
instead
not
of
Zoom, I'm told.
seats.
It's not secure enough
But this
for
weekend
governments.
it's being
But
broadcast
they
in
will
its
endorse
entirety,
what's happened today, and
overnight
they will
on
look to
radio
work out
stations in
what
numerous
they
countries
call
across
this
the world,
now dead
including
term, Corona bonds.
much of Europe,
Can the
the
French,
US, Canada,
they seem
and
to
New
have a
Zealand,
compromise.
as
Can they go
the
for a
issue
French
of
idea
sleep
of
becomes even
some
more
kind of
important for
way
people
forward
living
to
under the
kind of share
COVID-19
mutual debt?
lockdown.
Again, it's in the
I
early
spoke
days.
to Mark.
Gavin, thank you
Max
very much for
Richter
joining me.
not long ago. And thank you, Philip Hampshire, for that business report. Now, have a listen to this.
It does speak to our situation in a way, so I think it is an appropriate piece of music to be playing now. The piece back in 2015 was written really as a response to
If
my
that
sense that
composition sounds dreamy
everything
or
was getting
makes you feel a
faster
little sleepy,
and
Several
we were
months should
losing
they
our
need
sort of
it.
sense
Again,
of
sleep
what mattered
It does
in
depend
life.
what countries decide in terms of interest rates. There's lots to be clarified.
We're
They've
very
got
data
past the main hurdle, I think.
saturated,
What
on
will
our
happen
screens
next week?
24/7.
EU
Has been
leaders
performed
will
around the
meet,
world
to make
to
a
not
piece
face-to-face,
that
screen-to-screen. They'll be on a
interrupt that
virtual chat room, not
and
Zoom, I'm
give
told.
us
It's
a
not secure enough
But this
for
weekend
governments.
it's being
But
broadcast
they
in its
will endorse
entirety,
what's happened today, and they
overnight
will
on
look to
radio
work out
stations in
what
numerous
they
countries
call
across
this
the world,
now dead
including
term,
Now, of course, we've
Corona
all
bonds.
got this
Can the
pause in
French,
our
Canada,
lives,
they seem
very
to have a compromise.
unwelcome
Can
pause.
they go for a French idea
becomes
of some
more
kind of
important
It does,
way
in a
forward
way,
to
give
under
us
the
kind of
COVID-19
share
a
mutual
moment
debt.
to
Again, it's in the
reflect
early
on
days.
things that really
Gavin,
matter to
thank you
us.
very much for
Richter.
joining me.
And I think
not long ago.
art,
Thank you,
music,
Philip Hampshire,
creativity
for that
can
business
really be
report.
helpful at such
Now,
times.
have a listen to this. And how do you suggest this music is best enjoyed?
It does speak to our
Should I listen
situation
to
in a
it
way,
in
so
full,
I think it
or
is
it
an
for
appropriate
people to
piece of
sleep
music to be
for
playing
example,
now.
and then
The
experience
piece back
different
in
moments as they
2015 was
start
written
and
really
go
as
back
a
to
response
sleep.
to
If
my
that
sense
composition
that
sounds
when
dreamy,
everything was getting
makes you feel a
faster,
people there aren't
sleepy.
any
and
rules.
Several
we were
months should
losing
they
our
need
Because it's
it.
an
sense
extract
of
of
for me
sleep
personally,
It
I
does
imagine
depend
the
what
piece
what
as a
countries decide in
landscape
terms of
to
interest
inhabit
rates.
while
There's
you're
lots to be
sleeping.
clarified.
We're
They've
very
got
data
past the main hurdle, I
saturated,
think.
on
What will
our
happen
screens
next week?
24/7.
EU
Has been
leaders
performed
will
around the
meet,
world
I think
not
it's a very
face-to-face, screen-to-screen. They'll be on a virtual chat room,
It's
not
an
Zoom, I'm
example
told. It's not
of
secure enough
But this
for
weekend
governments.
it's being
But
broadcast
they
in its
will endorse
entirety,
what's happened today, and they
overnight
will
on
look to
radio
work
stations
out
in
what
numerous
they
countries
call
across
this
the world,
now dead
including
term,
Now, of course, we've all
Corona
got
bonds.
this
Can the
pause in
French,
our lives,
they seem to
very
have a compromise.
unwelcome
Can
pause.
they go for a French idea
becomes
of some
more
kind
important
of
It does,
way
in a way,
forward
give
to
us
kind of
a
share mutual
moment
debt?
to
Again, it's in the
reflect on
early
the things
days.
that really
Gavin,
matter to
thank you
us.
very much for joining me.
And I think of just having a bit more mental space to think about things, a little bit of a quieter mind, which I think, in this horrible time of anxiety is super valuable. of just having a bit more mental space to think about things, a little bit of a quieter mind, which I think, in this horrible time of anxiety is super valuable.
It is. I fall asleep. I fall asleep to this sort of music every night.
Oh my goodness. Are you dreaming more? I must admit, I am having more anxiety dreams right now, Alan.
I know.
To think about.
I need your voice
bit of a quieter
and this
mind,
music in my ears.
which I think, in this
can arrange
horrible
that.
time of anxiety
It's a
is super valuable.
music, isn't it? It is.
It is
I fall asleep.
As is your voice. That was Newsday from the BBC World Service. Take care of yourselves this Easter weekend. Are you dreaming
Alan
more?
and
I
myself
must admit, I am having more
Just having
anxiety
a bit more
dreams right
mental
now, Alan.
space
I know.
to think about.
I need your
A little bit
voice
of a quieter
and this
mind,
music in my ears.
which I think, in this
can arrange
horrible
that.
time of anxiety
It's a
is super
music.
This is the
valuable.
BBC World Service,
I
where our
fall asleep.
Life Changes season continues
Newsday
with Saeed
from the
Hashemi
BBC World
exploring the
Service. Take care of
upsides of
yourselves this Easter
ADHD.
weekend. Are you dreaming
Alan and
more? I
myself
must admit, I am having more
Just having
anxiety
a bit more
dreams right
mental
now, Alan.
space
I know.
to think about.
I need your
This is a bit
voice
of a quieter
and this
mind,
music in my ears.
which I think, in this
can arrange
horrible
that.
time of anxiety
It's a
is
This
super
is
valuable.
BBC World Service,
I
where our
fall
Life
asleep.
Changes season continues with Saeed Hashemi exploring the
Take
upsides
care of
of
yourselves this Easter
ADHD.
weekend. Are you dreaming
Alan and
more? I
myself
must admit, I am having more anxiety dreams right now.
To think about.
I need your voice and this music in my ears.
Which I think, in this horrible time of anxiety is super
This is
valuable.
BBC World Service.
You're broken because of the way societies treat this trait. But the reality is, I'm less broken than everybody else.
ADHD and Me, Tuesday at 8:30 and 15:30 GMT.
BBC World Service. As the global number of cases of COVID-19 race past 1.5 million, and we see how hard it is to contain the disease, even when you can keep your distance and clean your hands. On Science in Action, we ask about the refugees in crowded camps.
The messages they are getting, distancing, hand washing, and they can't do it. They are in very, very bad conditions, and we should evacuate at least all the elderly people with chronic diseases.
Science in Action after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. EU finance ministers have agreed a rescue package for member countries hit hardest by the coronavirus pandemic. It'll make more than $500 billion available to help workers, businesses and governments. Italy and Spain welcome the deal. The South Korean city of Daegu, which was the centre of the country's coronavirus epidemic, has recorded no new cases for the first time since the outbreak began. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed. Meanwhile, South Korea has begun 2 days of early voting ahead of next week's parliamentary elections. An agreement by oil exporting countries to reduce production has suffered a setback, with Mexico reluctant to take its share of the cuts. OPEC nations and Russia had tentatively agreed to slash output by 10 million barrels a day to counter the slump in demand caused by the coronavirus crisis. Oil prices have plunged in recent weeks. New York has started to bury some of its dead in mass graves as the city's daily death rate from the outbreak continues to rise. Images taken by drones show labourers working on Hart Island, placing pine coffins in long trenches. Yemen has reported its first coronavirus case in the east of the country. Aid groups have warned that the virus could be catastrophic for Yemen's healthcare system, which has been ruined by war. Detainees in Australia's immigration centres are asking the authorities to release them into the community after a case of COVID-19 was confirmed in a facility. The inmates say it's impossible to self-isolate. And an international mission to Mercury is swinging past Earth in a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. It's due to go into orbit around Mercury in 2025. BBC News.
Welcome to Science in Action from the BBC World Service with me, Roland Pease, where in a moment we'll hear about the difficulties of keeping coronavirus out of the refugee camps around the world. We're also getting the bigger picture about the way diseases like COVID-19 emerge out of the animal kingdom.
For these viruses that are zoonotic, we found 142 cases where there's good evidence about how animals and humans have shared these viruses. It's a pretty rare event. And it's especially rare that a virus will emerge and cause a pandemic of this scale. thankfully. But what we're concerned about is it's becoming increasingly common.
I'll be hearing about how much the atmosphere has cleared because of the worldwide lockdowns, and the alien comet from another solar system, Borisov, has split apart, revealing just what it's made of.
You'd say this is a solar system comet. Everything from composition to the way it's got a tail and a coma and it fragments. So we can explain it with everything we know about our comets, which is good. It means physics and chemistry works just as well in other solar systems as it does here. That's good.
What's not good is that the number of COVID cases this week has passed 1.5 million. Not quite the week-on-week doubling we've seen over the past month, but a huge increase nonetheless. Since the coronavirus outbreak started, we have covered a lot of the detailed science here on Science in Action, like the tracking of its spread, its testing, the drugs and the vaccines that are being worked on. But ultimately, the concern is people, ordinary people who can catch the virus and, in too many cases, then die. We've seen in New York, surely an emblem of modernity, how quickly the contagion can take hold. So what chance then for those who have sought shelter in the large refugee camps dotted around the world? Refugee camps like that at Moria on the Greek island of Lesbos. Hilda Vochten is medical coordinator in Greece for the health charity Médecins Sans Frontières.
The Moria refugee camp in Lesbos has a capacity normally for almost 3,000 people, and today around 20,000 people are living in this camp. So it's very clear that this is not adapted, that is overcrowded, that this is lacking all necessary sanitation capacity. There has not been a scale up. There are areas where there are one toilet for 167 people. For the showers, it's like one shower for 242 people.
We've been told so much about the need to wash your hands, to keep your distance, to avoid contact with people. And obviously this is tough under those conditions.
People are living really on top of each other in the camp itself. The ISO boxes are one next to each other. There are also two families living in one ISO box. So you have to imagine two families from 5-6 persons on a few square meters. But also the people that are scattered around the camp, they are more living in self-made tents. There's one tent next to the other. People are just all packed on each other. So it's very, very dangerous. If there is one case in the camp, it will go very, very fast, the spread of the disease. Even if they will try to isolate themselves in the tent, for their basic needs, they have to go out, they have to go to the toilet, where they have to queue, they have to go to the shower, they have to queue, and also for the food, they have to queue in the food line too. So they are exposed several times in a day to the virus, maybe if it's in the camp, certainly if they are queuing and the distance is not respected. And also the other measure we have to do is washing a lot our hands. But if there is one tap in for 1,300 people in some areas, people cannot wash on time their hands. And so spreading of the disease towards people will be very fast too.
And have there been cases yet?
In the camp itself, not yet. There has been a few cases, 6 cases confirmed in Lesbos Island. But not in the refugee camp itself.
And you can be pretty sure of that, can you? I presume that along with all the other problems, you don't really have much in the way of means to test people.
It's true that we cannot test people because that would be reassuring. I'm not convinced that there is already a big outbreak because otherwise we would have more people with severe diseases or respiratory distress that we have to refer to the hospital. And that's not the case. That doesn't mean it is not starting because the first cases are not always evident. We'll have to wait for this first severe case to really be able to confirm it.
I mean, I guess that medical experts like you are all too sadly familiar with infectious outbreaks in these conditions, even before we had COVID. You presumably have a pretty good idea of how these things can progress if they're not tackled quickly.
Yes, of course. We had already a measles outbreak in the camp. Of course, that is a bit easier because this is a disease that is known. It's also easier to react because we have vaccination, so we can launch a vaccination campaign. Now we are confronted with a pandemic that is overall in the world, and it's more difficult for us to get extra human resources, extra supplies. We have other challenges on top today.
I don't know whether for some of the refugees, they have so many problems already that COVID-19 doesn't even particularly rank. What are people saying to you in the camps, and what are you able to do to reassure them?
Of course, it's very difficult to reassure them if the messages they are getting from the government, from the Ministry of Health, is distancing, hand washing. They are witnessing that they can't do it. Of course, there are other things ongoing, like other organizations are distributing self-made masks. But again, they are in very, very bad conditions, and we should evacuate at least all the elderly people and the people with chronic diseases to a safer place.
Lesbos is just a small example of what's happening presumably across the world. Every refugee camp and even every place where refugees are gathering will be vulnerable to the same issues, won't they?
Depends on the condition of the refugee camp. I have seen a lot, for example, in African countries, and they are certainly also in very bad conditions. There are a few camps also in Greece that are in better conditions than Moria. They are all overcrowded, they are all over capacity, but there's a bit of more space in the camps or the mainland, or they are a bit smaller, maybe 2,000 people in the camp. But again, it's not the same than living in your own apartment or house where you can apply the appropriate measures. It's still not how it should be.
I mean, it must break your heart that you're dealing with these people who are among the most vulnerable on the planet, and it seems that they're being ignored in this COVID crisis.
For sure. And it was already impossible before the COVID. In Lesbos, in Moria camp, the increase was already so unbelievable in 2019. There were always 5,000, 6,000 people. We ended up at the end of the year with 19,000 people. And we saw the impact on the people, on their well-being, on the mental health. We saw much more people coming to our services, even children with self-harm that stopped speaking. And for sure, this COVID on top, where there even are more restrictive measures, so they are really now in a kind of detention mode. This will even increase the suffering of the people. I'm really worried what we are going to find when the COVID is over. How people have suffered, yes.
Hilde Vochten of Médecins Sans Frontières. Further genetic evidence was published last week indicating the COVID-19 virus came from pangolins, small, scaly mammals poached for their meat and supposed medicinal value. Researchers call these disease crossings from the animal kingdom into humans zoonoses. And when Christine Kreuter-Johnson hit the submit button on her study of zoonoses last November, she had no idea how relevant her findings would be in just a matter of months. Now published by the Royal Society, the survey shows how many of our diseases come from species that are endangered by hunting or habitat destruction, species like bats.
There has been a number of emerging infectious diseases from bats lately, and that includes also Ebola virus, where we think the actual reservoir is a bat species, so primates would get sick from exposure to viruses from bats just like people do. Also Nipah virus, which has emerged in Malaysia and continues to cause outbreaks in Bangladesh, likely has a bat reservoir. That bat species is very impacted by habitat change and deforestation and is looking for new habitat, and in doing so is coming into closer proximity to people.
Is there something about bats that means that they're more likely to be infected, or is this more to do with the exposure between us and them?
There's probably some unique aspects to the physiology of bats that makes them likely to have a lot of diseases. Also their behaviors, they roost in big, dense congregations with sometimes multiple species, and they also migrate. And they're very unusual in that they're a flying mammal, but also they're a big, diverse group of many species. And so that just means that they probably have a lot of viruses, some of which could be pre-adapted to infect people, or they could be evolving over time to infect people. And that's where the potential for disease sharing becomes higher risk.
So are there any lessons about the virus's behavior that means that we can know a bit more about what the future danger is?
That's definitely something that is starting to inform on this current outbreak. So we've actually looked at the genetic fingerprint of the viruses, and that's where we're starting to see some clues that there's a very closely related virus in bats. There's also genetic information in this current SARS-2 virus that implicates pangolins. That's all being pieced together by genetic information from the virus, because we lack right now any kind of surveillance of these species that could inform on the epidemiologic circumstances or the ecological circumstances that might have precipitated spillover in this case.
On the other hand, in a sense, the lesson from your paper could be that the threat is so diverse and overwhelming. It could be any number of viruses from any number of species, and we never know whether they're going to be relatively short-lived, for example, like the original SARS, or not quite as dangerous as we first thought, as with Zika, or like this coronavirus, you suddenly find that this is actually knocking the world for a six. It's hard to know where to start looking under those circumstances.
And most animal viruses stay in animals and they don't pose a threat to us. And the few that do spill over, again, in our work for these viruses that are zoonotic, we found 142 cases where there's good evidence about how animals and humans have shared these viruses. It's a pretty rare event, and it's especially rare that a virus will emerge and cause a pandemic of this scale, thankfully. But what we're concerned about is it's becoming increasingly common, and the fact that we're all so well connected on the planet now, anything that happens anywhere in the world can affect all of us. Some of the things that we found in this paper that really highlighted some especially high-risk activities, so exploitation of wildlife, where we're going into natural habitat, collecting animals, putting them in the wildlife trade, where we've got a lot of diverse species, and these are live animals with very close contact with each other and close contact with people. Those are really the perfect opportunity for diseases to be shared across species, including to humans. We do suspect that emerging infectious diseases, although rare, are going to increase in frequency over time, given the modification of habitat on the planet.
And it is interesting. You talked about Nipah virus. We've talked about SARS, MERS. There's Zika. We have these new diseases erupting into the human population pretty frequently. It's not like we weren't warned.
That's right. And even with coronaviruses, I do feel like we've been warned. We have coronaviruses that cause the common cold that have been seasonally distributed and are now endemic and circulate around the world in the human population. And then we had SARS, which we really lucked out with that one. That was through a major public health effort. And there were circumstances that were able to come into play for that allowed that to be contained. But even since SARS, there have been 2 new coronaviruses that were detected in people that just caused the common cold. And those viruses were discovered in the early 2000s, and they also circulate worldwide now in the human population. And then on top of that, we had MERS emerge, which is got a very high fatality rate and has caused several epidemics over the last 8 years or so. But we've seen these hints of, coronaviruses and how they are an important group and something we should be thinking about. So I think we have been warned, and I think we need to heed the warning. When this pandemic first emerged in China, there was some disbelief or some sort of, disconnect in our understanding of how that was going to really come to affect all of us.
Given that there are all these animal species carrying potentially dangerous viruses, is there anything to be gained from sort of going out and looking at what the viruses are? Or can you actually get a heads up on what may be around the corner for us that way?
Yeah, I think with bats, we had discovered a lot of novel coronaviruses where there were, I think, over 140 new coronaviruses that this project alone discovered in bat species in Africa and Asia. And some of those were SARS-like. So once we found that high level of diversity, and we also found a new Ebola virus in bats, we generated materials that we can share with communities that have a lot of close contact with bats. And the materials were called Living Safely with Bats. And we translated that into dozens of languages and have shared that with communities so that they can understand how to minimize disease transmission from bats to people. And certainly high-risk activities, that result in exploitation and driving down species to endangered status is sort of, a no-brainer in terms of what we need to do to regulate that. And yes, people need to have food security and people need to have livelihoods. How can we do this in a way that is not endangering species and increasing public health risk?
Animal health expert Christine Kreuder-Johnson of the University of California in Davis, with lessons it seems that we really struggle to learn. Social media have been awash with suggestions as the world's economies have shut down to tackle COVID-19 that the atmosphere has become a lot cleaner. The skies are brighter, I've been reading. Now, a few years ago, Professor James Lee took me to the top of iconic BT Tower in London, where his instruments sampled the entirety of the city's air. So it was to James I turned to hear the detail about this atmospheric brightening.
What we've observed since the shutdown, and actually a little bit before it, is a significant drop, particularly in the concentrations of NO2, so nitrogen dioxide, which is essentially emitted mainly from diesel vehicles, and it's one of the key air pollutants in cities. And we've seen a drop of anywhere between 30 to 50% in that in different cities around the UK.
And give me a sense of what 50% cut means. Is that, for example, the difference you might see between the Christmas break or a weekend?
On average, taking out any effect of the weather, it's probably something like a Christmas day. It's much more stark than a weekday weekend drop. In a lot of cities, the traffic is fairly similar at the weekend. Yeah, it's probably more akin to an extended Christmas day.
Are you comparing notes with your opposite numbers in, well, I've seen maps from Italy, for example, where there have been significant decreases. Presumably there's a community of you comparing notes.
Absolutely, yeah. All of this data is publicly available, and the guys that are keeping these sites running are doing an amazing job, such that I can sit in my dining room and just download the data almost in real time. But we've looked at data from across Europe, and you see broadly the same pattern, obviously with a bit of a time offset depending on when the lockdowns were introduced in the various different countries and cities across the continent.
It might be unfair to spring this one on you, but I have seen some suggestions that the background of air pollution, particularly in China, for example, where it's so extreme, may be playing a role in the mortality rates that they're seeing with COVID, with the coronavirus. And I don't know whether that makes sense to you. I don't know whether that's already known, for example, from flu and pneumonia.
It does make some sense to me that if you're exposed to high levels of air pollution, then I guess the reason is that your lungs are more susceptible to other conditions, which obviously the coronavirus is the thing that seems to attack the lungs most. And those that have had years of exposure to poor air seemingly have a higher mortality rate from coronavirus.
When I was looking at the moon, which was so fantastic this week, I did think the atmosphere looks cleaner. But I don't know, was I imagining that, or is it a change that's enough to be visible to the naked eye?
I've had a couple of people say that to me, that they think the night sky looks brighter. The situation with particles is a lot less clear than it is with NO2. Because particles come from a wider range of sources, you can't quite see the reduction in particles in some cities as much as you can in the gas pollutants. There has been a reduction. Whether that's enough to make the skies clearer, or whether that's just a meteorological effect, or whether there is less light pollution because there's less vehicles around.
It's one thing to talk about the atmosphere in Britain and in Europe, where on the whole the regulations are pretty tight. But when I've been in China or in India or a number of other countries, the sky is visibly grey with the air pollution. It's much worse. Do you know what kind of improvements in air quality they're having?
My guess would be there will be some improvement, but a lot of the reason why you get that, particularly in countries like India, where the very thick, sort of highly particulate pollutions there is due to a lot of sort of open burning and agricultural burning, which we don't have in this country, in Western Europe. Most of our pollution comes from vehicles or industry, which, although it's bad, are controlled. That we try and scrub most of the particulates that we can out of most things that burn fossil fuels, whereas in India, a lot of the burning is uncontrolled and so causes this very thick pollution. Now, what I don't know is how much of that has stopped. Presumably, a lot of the burning of rubbish is still going on because that's not part of the lockdown.
So we may be celebrating this cleaner atmosphere just now, but I guess that when we turn all our car engines back on, all the benefits will disappear as quickly as we turn the car engines on.
Potentially, yes. When the traffic goes back up to normal levels, the air pollution will follow it.
It doesn't accumulate. It's pretty instantaneous, is it?
Certainly the NO2 is pretty instantaneous. The particles is a bit more complicated. From a personal point of view, I think that actually in the medium term, maybe next year to 18 months, we may well see less traffic on the roads, though, even when things are back to normal, because I think people will, and it's great the publicity that it's had, because it may well make people think, oh, well, do I actually need to travel to work today, or can I do it from home? Do I need to go to this meeting, or can I do it remotely? So I do think, and this is just my personal opinion, that it may well have a behavioural change going forward that may well make our air cleaner.
James Lee, Professor of Clean Air at the University of York. Well, the clear atmosphere may be giving us a spectacular view of the night sky, but spectacular things are also going on in their own right now. We've been following the remarkable journey of Comet Borisov since it first passed into sight from another part of the galaxy last September. The visiting comet has long since zipped past the sun and is now heading back into outer space. But then it started to break up. Carey Liss of Johns Hopkins University was among the astronomers watching.
It definitely calved or fragmented. At the end of March, it went from being a comet with a nice round coma and a bit of a tail to an object that looked like it had the Batman-shaped coma.
How big are these bits? I can't even remember how big Comet Borisov it was in the first place.
Well, you have to define big. You mean big as in the source, the object that is if you will, it's the iceberg that's actually spitting out gas and dust?
That's what I was thinking.
It's a fraction of a kilometer in radius. It's small. If you're talking about the whole process, which is what happens, the gas and dust is emitted from this, if you will, this very dirty snowball, and then spreads out into a coma and then a tail, that can be many thousands to hundreds of thousands of kilometers in extent.
Your thinking is that there's something that's fallen apart, the snowball at the middle of it. You're seeing then all the dust and gas sort of separating into two objects, effectively.
What we see from Earth is the very fine particles of dust that are scattering sunlight, the coma and the tail. Most of the mass is actually in the central dirty snowball. So Borisov was an object that is definitely coming from another solar system. Our most likely guess is that it is an object that was thrown out of another solar system when that solar system was trying to make a Jupiter-like object, trying to make a giant planet. And for every object that falls in and becomes part of that exo-Jupiter, another object could easily barely miss, but instead get thrown out with a beautiful gravitational kick and thrown out of the system all which ways.
And when it arrived to sort of last September at great speed, sort of coming through the solar system from above, as it were. It's not in the plane of the solar system. It's now sort of going away from us. Is that right?
That's very right. Basically went straight from north to south through our solar system and went through at a distance about 2 AU, or 2 times the distance of the sun to the Earth to the sun. So it basically didn't come much closer to us or to the sun than about 2 times the normal distance between us and the sun.
I've heard of comets breaking up before, but it's been when they've been getting warmed on the way into the sun, not on the way out.
Normally what we're used to hearing is like Comet Ison, which was a fantastic comet, was going to go by all the planets, then come out and go by the Earth, but died on top of the sun. That's because it went right next to the sun and got severely heat treated, shall we say, and basically started boiling like crazy and just blew up. And that's what we see for a lot of comets that come close to the sun. So what we think happened with Borisov, if it is an object that it was formed and then thrown out pretty quickly. It doesn't take too long. In our own system, we think that you form comets within the first million years or so, and you form Jupiter in the next 2 million years. And these objects that form Jupiter or get thrown out don't have billions of years to go slowly by the sun and get processed and lose some of their volatiles, but not all of them. And so this hasn't had a chance, if you will, to sinter and settle and slowly get used to the fact that sometimes it gets heated up every million-year orbit. Instead, this thing most likely got kicked out, having never been near its own parent star. And then, last September, from near the first time in its life, it has come close to a hot stellar object. And so it takes a little while for that heat, we call it a thermal wave, that heat to kind of transfer and to percolate down into the interior. The heat got down far enough and hit a weak spot, or maybe an icy pocket, made a lot of gas, and helped blow off a part of its surface.
Have you got telescope time to look at it?
Yeah, we have Hubble time. We've just asked for some more. I can tell you that We already have seen evidence that the crescent or Batman-like shape, which we think was due to a fragment or multiple fragments being slowly separating from the parent nucleus, iceberg, if you will, or a snowball, has gone away. It's becoming much, much more round again. It is slowly probably just separating. We think it's something like 0.3 or 0.4 meters per second. So as slow as you can walk.
But it's all a bit shrouded in this fantastic extrasolar, interplanetary alien dust.
If you didn't know its orbit, if I didn't tell you, I just showed you the data, you'd say this is a solar system comet. Everything from composition to the way it's got a tail and a coma and it fragments, so we can explain it with everything we know about our comets, which is good. It means physics and chemistry works just as well in other solar systems as it does here. That's good.
Astronomer Kerry Liss. And as Comet Borisov continues its voyage into the darkness of space. So it's time for me, Roland Pease, producer Julian Siddle, and all the Science in Action team to take our leave too. Do visit our webpage at bbcworldservice.com to see our continuing coverage of coronavirus. And until we meet next time, keep well.
This is the BBC World Service, where teenagers talk to the technology pioneers who've shaped their lives.
What do our most successful innovators think about the inventions they unleashed upon the world?
1,000 songs in your pocket. No one ever had that experience before.
Teenagers like me question the people who invented the tech, finding out how they came up with their ideas and asking for advice.
Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something.
Worldwise Web at bbcworldservice.com. And in half an hour, it's Business Daily.
From memes to musical numbers and goats running wild, we'll be hearing from the people making the internet content that's offering some light relief during the pandemic and getting us through these long lockdown days.
On air, online and on mobile, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news on the BBC World Service, it's Hard Talk with me, Stephen Sacker. The coronavirus pandemic is a multi-layered global crisis. It starts with public health, but it reaches deep into the world economy and the global security system too. Could COVID-19 fears be used for malign purposes? Will the crisis enhance or undermine multilateral institutions? My guest today is Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO.
I think this crisis proves the importance of countries working together. It proves the importance of having structures in place, as NATO has, to mobilize military capabilities to help the civilian society fight a health crisis and make sure that this health crisis doesn't become a serious security crisis, and that's exactly what NATO is doing.
Has his organisation risen to this massive challenge?
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. EU finance ministers have agreed an emergency rescue package for member countries hit hardest by the coronavirus pandemic. It'll make more than $500 billion available to help workers, businesses and governments. Our business reporter Andrew Wood has more details.
There will be loans of €100 billion to go to a scheme to subsidise wages. The idea is that companies would cut working hours and not cut jobs. The European Investment Bank is going to lend up to €200 billion to companies, and also the European Stability Mechanism. That's going to make €240 billion of cheap credit available to governments. So they'll be able to basically keep spending money, and they won't have to worry too much about gigantic interest bills. That's the theory.
The South Korean city of Daegu, which was the centre of the country's coronavirus epidemic, has recorded no new cases for the first time since the outbreak began 2 months ago. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed, the lowest number in 7 weeks. Laura Bicker reports from Seoul.
No new reported cases of coronavirus in the city of Daegu is good news, but health officials have issued a stark warning ahead of the Easter weekend. They're concerned about large church services, and the Prime Minister has urged religious groups to refrain from mass gatherings. Meanwhile, South Koreans are heading to the polls, which have opened for 2 days of early voting ahead of the parliamentary elections next week. All voters are advised to wear masks, they'll have their temperature checked and be kept at least 1 metre apart from others while waiting to cast their ballot.
An agreement by oil exporting countries to reduce production has hit a snag, with Mexico reluctant to take its share of the cuts. OPEC nations and Russia had tentatively agreed to slash output by 10 million barrels a day to counter the slump in demand caused by the coronavirus crisis. New York has started to bury some of its dead in mass graves as the city's daily death rate from the coronavirus outbreak continues to rise. The dead, in pine coffins, are buried in long, narrow trenches. A Democratic councillor in New York City, Daniel Drom, says the hospital in his district is now at full capacity and only treating COVID-19 patients. And he says there are social issues to address as well.
My district is about 68% recent immigrants to the United States, everybody from all over the world. And they face many issues like immigrants all over the world do. But we have health disparities, we have food disparities. So those have become more evident as the crisis has gone along. And I'm trying to address many of those things now.
World News from the BBC. The British government says the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in the early phase of his recovery from coronavirus after he was moved out of intensive care last night. Mr. Johnson is continuing to receive treatment in a hospital in London. Singapore is taking steps to combat a spike in coronavirus cases among migrant workers living in cramped dormitories. Monica Miller reports from Singapore.
Officials are setting up army camps, floating hotels, and vacant public housing lots to contain the spread of the disease after officials announced an additional 287 new cases. That's the highest daily tally so far. More than 200 are related to foreign workers who live in dormitories who now need to move to larger accommodations. They say it spread among workers who visited a busy shopping center and later infected their colleagues. Singapore has been praised for its swift and thorough handling of the pandemic.
Detainees in Australia's immigration centres are asking the authorities to release them into the community after a case of COVID-19 was confirmed in a facility. The inmates say it's impossible to self-isolate, and some say they're on a hunger strike in protest. The government insists there are plans for dealing with cases within its detention network. Yemen has reported its first coronavirus case in Hadramaut Governorate in the east of the country. The emergency committee run by the internationally recognised government said the infected patient was in a stable condition. Aid groups have warned that the virus could have a catastrophic impact on Yemen's healthcare system. An international mission to Mercury is swinging past the Earth on a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. The European-Japanese Bepi Colombo mission is flying past Earth, Venus and Mercury and using their gravity to slow it down. It'll finally reach the right speed to go into orbit around Mercury in 2025. BBC News.
Welcome to Hard Talk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sackur. In a world currently preoccupied with responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, what consideration, if any, should we be giving to the global security implications of the crisis? With me to discuss that is Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, the transatlantic mutual defence alliance that has underpinned the West's security strategy for 7 decades. There are already worrying signs that far from bringing the world's great powers together, the pandemic has become another opportunity for projecting national self-interest. In this time of new vulnerability, will mistrust heighten global insecurity? Well, Jens Stoltenberg joins me now on the line from Brussels. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me ask you this. How is the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic across the world, affecting NATO's ability to carry out its mission?
The reality is that NATO is carrying out its mission as we did before the crisis. Of course, we have made some adjustments. We have to also take into our organization the consequences of the coronavirus crisis. But fundamentally, we continue to provide deterrence and defense. We maintain our operational readiness. We maintain the forces deployable, the high readiness forces, the combat groups in the eastern part of the alliance, and missions and operations fighting international terrorism. So NATO's main responsibility in this crisis is to make sure that this health crisis doesn't become a security crisis, and therefore NATO continues to maintain credible deterrence and defense.
Right, that message of business as usual, though, surely it doesn't tally with the facts. I'm looking at the fact, for example, that a major training exercise that you had planned, I believe you were calling it Defender 2020, it has effectively been ruined by the impact of coronavirus, and in particular the fact that US forces have been issued with an order not to take part and indeed not to move.
So we have adjusted the way we work. So we have adapted some exercises, we have cancelled some exercises, we have reduced the people working in the NATO headquarters, but that doesn't undermine our ability to maintain what we call our operational readiness, meaning our ability to deploy forces if needed. We maintain, as I said, our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance and our missions and operations, air policing or our naval deployments.
But with respect, Secretary General, that can't be the case. I mean, you've had to cancel a very important exercise which was supposed to involve 37,000 troops. You've had troops come up positive in tests for coronavirus in Lithuania. You've got a big problem in Afghanistan where service members of the NATO force have also tested positive and many others have been confined to barracks. You can't pretend to me that this is normal. It most definitely isn't, and your capacities have been undermined.
No, it's not normal, and I'm not saying that nothing has changed. Actually, we have changed a lot the way we do our work. But what I'm saying is that despite the crisis, despite that we have changed the way we work, we're actually able to deliver our core task, and that's credible deterrence and defense, also in the midst of a crisis. Actually, NATO is a readiness organization. NATO is created to cope with crisis, and therefore we are also coping with this crisis, knowing that we have to adapt, a change when we are faced with a crisis as the corona crisis.
What do you think potential enemies of NATO's member states make of a situation where, for example, the very famous American aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt is effectively taken out of action because coronavirus has spread to the crew on board. The captain calls for emergency help and is then fired by the Pentagon for breaking the rules. It looks as though your most important member state and its military have been crippled by fears of coronavirus.
As I said, I'm not saying that this doesn't have any consequences at all. I'm saying that NATO is able to maintain its readiness, our high readiness forces, our response forces, NATO missions and operations, air policing, naval deployments and all that. The US aircraft carrier is actually not part of the NATO responsibilities I'm talking about, so I will not comment specifically on that, but I'm only saying that we have worked for years to make sure that NATO will function also in different kinds of crisis, and therefore I'm glad to see that we are able to deliver on our core task, but of course adjusting with the way we do it.
You keep telling me about this core task and how it is being maintained. How do you think the Afghans, both military leaders, political leaders, and ordinary people in Afghanistan, feel about this multinational operation on their soil, that is the NATO and US operation on their soil, when members of the international military are bringing coronavirus with them into their country? Doesn't it undermine the confidence people will have in hosting NATO forces on their territory?
The coronavirus affects us all countries, all institutions, all organizations, and of course it also affects NATO. Of course, there are people in NATO missions and operations who are infected, and many of them are in quarantine. That has actually been implemented as a precautionary measure. But I know that the people in Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan, they very much welcome that NATO maintain its mission in Afghanistan. We are there to help to fight international terrorism. We are there to send a clear message to Taliban that they will not win on the battlefield, and we continue to be there. So yes, we have adjusted the way we do our job, but yes, we continue to be in Afghanistan, help to fight international terrorism.
Do you agree with the analyst Christopher Skaluba, who works at the Atlantic Council, an expert in NATO affairs, who says that after this is all over, there needs to be some really serious thinking about how, in his words, pandemics can, within weeks, degrade military operations and fragment unity amongst the closest of allies? Do you agree with him?
I think that after any crisis or every crisis, we need to draw some lessons and adapt and change the way we do operations and our missions. And that will, of course, also be the case after the corona crisis. I think that not only NATO, but also NATO allies more in general, have to look into the issue of stocks, medical equipment, protective suits, and all those things which have proven in scarce or lack of in this crisis.
How embarrassing has it been, do you believe, that within NATO member states there's been a great deal of propaganda benefit coming to Russia and China, who have sent supplies to NATO member states, supplies that they apparently couldn't get from fellow members of your organization? How embarrassing is that?
Well, what we see now is that NATO allies, despite this crisis, are providing significant support to each other. We have seen how NATO have used its capabilities to lift, airlift equipment around the globe to support the NATO allies, and how also NATO allies are providing support to each other.
With respect, Secretary General, that's not really what we've seen. I'm looking at one extraordinary French radio report from April 2nd, which is headlined, "Face masks from China intended for France were hijacked by the United States," who at the last minute jumped into a deal between France and China, offering a much higher price to the Chinese to get tens of thousands of face masks, millions of face masks. I mean, France and the US are supposed to be NATO partners. What on earth is going on?
But first of all, I think we have to distinguish between the fact that NATO allies are actually providing help to each other, and the amount of help that has been provided from NATO allies to NATO allies is much bigger than the help that has come from China or Russia. But again, this is not a competition about who can provide the most help. This is a global crisis that requires a global response, and we need to help each other.
Okay, I see your point, but let me ask you just a very blunt question. Do you think the people of, let's say, Italy and Spain, where the coronavirus impact has hit very hard, do you think that they feel they've received sufficient support from fellow NATO member states?
Normally, when we have a natural disaster or a crisis, only a limited number of countries are affected, and then the others can provide help to those affected. Now, everyone is affected, and that makes the whole situation more difficult because not all allies have spare capacity. And that's exactly the reason why I really think that one of the lessons we really have to look into after this crisis is the availability of masks, protective suits, and so on. But that's, in a way, a lesson we have to look into after we have addressed the most immediate crisis.
You and I have talked in the past about your concerns about cyber warfare coming from different sources, but you've mentioned Russia and China in the past. There was an EU report issued just a couple of weeks ago talking about a significant disinformation campaign by Russian state media and pro-Kremlin outlets regarding the COVID-19 crisis in Europe. What are you in NATO, as protectors of Europe from cyber warfare and that kind of damaging propaganda, what are you doing? Are you seeing it, and what are you doing about it?
So we see attempts to do disinformation and propaganda. At the same time, I'd like to highlight that this is a global crisis. We need to mobilize global unity in fighting the coronavirus. But of course, we are vigilant. We are responding when we see disinformation. I believe that the best answer to propaganda is not propaganda, but the best answer to the propaganda is the truth. And we provide facts, we are open and transparent, but I think that the most important tool we have in fighting disinformation and propaganda is a free and independent press. It's journalists asking difficult questions, asking for response or checking their sources. So news, institutions like the BBC and all other free and independent media are playing a key role in making sure that we are not victims of propaganda.
Right. Now, you tell me that the world needs to find unity, global unity, you've said several times during this interview. What do you make of the fact that the leader of by far the most important NATO member state, the United States, and of course I'm talking about President Donald Trump, refers to the coronavirus as, his phrase, the Chinese virus, claims that China has deliberately withheld information to damage the United States, and is now attacking the World Health Organization, claiming that it is China-centric?
My main responsibility is to make sure that the NATO allies stand together and help the civilian society, the healthcare services, to cope with these crises, provide help and support to them, and that's exactly what we do. I will just undermine my task of keeping this alliance together if I start to comment on each and every leader. What I know is that NATO allies agreed a statement last week at our foreign ministerial meeting where we addressed this as a global challenge. We called on unity in facing this global challenge, and we refer to it as COVID-19, a global challenge to all of us. So that's agreed language among 29, now actually 30 NATO allies, and that's what I'm working, my work is based on.
But my point is that you are part of a multilateral organization. You want to see global unity. I'm asking you, as a significant world figure, what you make of a US president who is currently attacking the World Health Organization, accusing it of being China-centric, and going further and suggesting that China has malign intentions.
But I will only undermine my position of trying to keep 30 allies together if I started to comment on the World Health Organization and different views about the role the World Health Organization is playing. My most urgent and most important task now is to make sure that we are mobilizing as much support to allies as possible. And we see that military personnel are actually playing a key role in the fight against the coronavirus. They are doing everything from controlling border crossings, disinfecting public spaces, setting up field hospitals, and providing military medical support. So the military, NATO are providing significant support in a critical situation. My main effort is to make sure that we continue and step up to do that.
Understood, and all of that is important. I don't mean to belittle it, but I just wonder what you make of what the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said to us on Hard Talk just a few days ago. He said, international cooperation has never been at this low a level before in the midst of a crisis. He is deeply concerned. Are you?
I'm also concerned, first of all, about the consequences of this crisis, and I think the fact that it affects all countries all around the world means that it's less spare capacity to provide support. That's a brutal reality, because most governments feel mainly responsible, or first of all responsible for their own populations, and that makes it harder to mobilize extra resources.
Mr. Guterres is pointing to something deeper. He's suggesting that there is across the world, amongst the big powers, a trend toward quite blatant nationalism, self-interest, that is hampering efforts to develop a truly internationally coordinated response. Do you see that too?
I see that some international institutions are, what should I say, in a difficult position, and that they have seen some reduced support for international cooperation. Again, since I'm the Secretary General of NATO, I have done whatever I can to at least make sure that NATO as an international institution has adapted, is strong, and is possible to deliver.
A quick thought that is very relevant to NATO's future. Economists are saying that such is the impact of the economic deep freeze that the world has entered as a result of the coronavirus lockdowns, that we're going to see contractions of national economies of between 5 and 20% in this current year. Now, that's disastrous. It means deficits and national debts are going to soar right around the world. Do you now acknowledge that it is impossible to imagine that all those countries in NATO who've committed to meet the 2% military spending pledge, they are in no way going to be able to meet those pledges in the next few years? Do you accept that?
I accept that the coronavirus, the COVID crisis, will have economic consequences. How big those economic consequences will be, of course, depends on how long this will last, but potentially severe economic consequences, especially for those who don't have so much from the beginning. So of course, these kind of crises always have a social profile, which is bad. Those who are in trouble from the beginning. They are always suffering more than those who have more.
Yeah, I mean, let's just, if we can, be very direct about this. There's no way that countries like Italy and Spain are going to meet the 2% threshold. And in fact, Christopher Scaluba, again, the expert at the Atlantic Council, said that what has happened in recent weeks and is going to happen over the next few months could well sound the death knell to those NATO military spending commitments. Donald Trump says if he doesn't get those commitments, NATO is obsolete. Leaves you with a huge problem.
But the challenge, the dilemma we are faced with is that, yes, there will be economic consequences of the corona crisis, but at the same time, the threats and the challenges that made us invest or decide to invest more in defense have not disappeared. We still are faced with terrorist threats. We are still faced with threats in cyberspace. We still see a more assertive Russia. And all these threats and challenges, they remain there despite the corona crisis.
Sure, but Mr. Stoltenberg, governments simply aren't going to have the money. They're not going to have the money.
But on the top of that, I think one thing we have seen in this crisis is that military personnel, the armed forces, actually provides a surge capacity for nations to deal with disastrous crises as the corona crisis. So when you look around across the NATO alliance, we see that investments in the military actually now provide a lot of capabilities which are used in fighting a civilian health crisis. So meaning that investing in military is not only a response to military threats, but also to, for instance, health crisis as the coronavirus crisis.
We must end soon. A quick couple of specific challenges that you face. I just want your thoughts on them. Afghanistan is a terrible mess right now. The Americans have done a deal with the Taliban. They're supposed to be drawing down their troops. And as a result, you in NATO are supposed to be drawing down your troop numbers as well to in fact, full withdrawal within 14 months. But we already see the peace deal is falling apart. There's been a fundamental disagreement over prisoner releases, both sides blaming the other, and the Americans saying that they might just abandon the peace deal and pull out unilaterally. It leaves you in NATO in an extraordinarily difficult position. What are you going to do?
It is a very difficult situation in Afghanistan, as it has been for a long time. And that's also the reason why we have decided to reduce our military presence from 16,000 troops to 12,000 NATO troops. We have also said that any further reduction has to be based on conditions. So we will only reduce our presence in Afghanistan if we see that the Taliban delivers on their commitment in the peace deal.
Hang on, what if the Americans just unilaterally pull their troops out, as Mike Pence said they might do just the other day?
Well, the United States has also made it clear as a NATO ally that this is conditions-based. It will be bad for all of us if we allow Afghanistan once again become a safe haven for international terrorists. We have to make.
Do you think the American policy right now, which seems to change from day to day, is irresponsible?
They have consulted closely with NATO allies in trying to reach an agreement with the Taliban. I believe that the only way out of the crisis in Afghanistan is to have an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned political process. And the main outcome of the agreement between the United States and Taliban, which is supported by NATO, is that it actually facilitates an inter-Afghan negotiation. So it's not an easy, it's a hard and long way to peace in Afghanistan, but the only way to reach that peace is by making sure that Afghans are taking responsibility for the peace process themselves, and that's actually the main purpose of the agreement between the US and Taliban.
One question on Turkey. As you well know, the Turks are about to make operational their very sophisticated Russian air defense system, the S-400 system, against the wishes of the United States, and I imagine against your hopes and wishes as well. Should Turkey, which is a member state of NATO, be punished for making those defense systems operational?
Turkey is an important ally. They have been extremely important, especially in the fight against Daesh, ISIS, international terrorism in Iraq and Syria. And we work with Turkey.
Should Turkey face sanctions? It's a very simple question.
Then I realize, and it's recognized by all NATO allies, that the Turkish decision to invest in the Russian system S-400 creates some problems within the alliance, and I have expressed my concerns about the consequences of the Turkish decision. And therefore, I welcome the fact that there is ongoing efforts to try to solve it. I spoke with President Erdogan recently about that. I've spoken with other allies about this issue, and we continue to try to find a way to address this issue, because the S-400 system will never be part of an integrated NATO air and missile system. And that's one of the challenges we are faced with.
A final thought, Mr. Secretary General. It comes based on a quote from another NATO expert here in London, Elizabeth Braw. She thinks very carefully about NATO's future. She's written this: COVID-19 is the worst national security crisis to hit NATO member states since the alliance was founded. Is this going to be NATO's moment to reassert its central relevance? Is it? Yes or no?
Yes, I think this crisis proves the importance of countries working together. It proves the importance of having structures in place, as NATO has, to mobilize military capabilities to help the civilian society fight a health crisis and make sure that this health crisis doesn't become a serious security crisis, and that's exactly what NATO is doing. But let me add that I would like to commend all those people on the front line. It's first and foremost health workers, but also military personnel who are every day fighting this crisis, helping people to cope with a very difficult situation for all of us.
Jens Stoltenberg, I thank you for joining me on Hard Talk from Brussels, and stay healthy.
Thank you so much.
This is the BBC World Service.
What would it be like if dinosaurs still roamed the Earth?
We probably still would have gotten wiped out eventually. Or we'd be pets. We have good grasping abilities. I bet, we could be useful.
What does space sound like?
So that is the sound of a gravitational wave signal coming from a black hole.
Will planting trees stop global warming?
We could capture about 2/3 of the full emissions of carbon that we've done to date. And that is only in the above ground biomass. That's the parts of the tree that are above the soil.
What would it be like to ride a beam of light?
From the point of view of a photon, which is a particle of light, the entire universe is perfectly still.
Understanding the world and looking to the future. Science on the BBC World Service.
In Business Daily shortly with me, Vivienne Nunes. What are you doing to keep your spirits up during this frightening time? We hear from the people who've been creating internet content just to make us smile during the long lockdown days. Hear tales of goats gone wild or learn a dodgy dance routine at home. That's coming up in just a moment.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. There's been a broad welcome to the coronavirus emergency package agreed by EU finance ministers late on Thursday. The deal will make $500 billion available immediately and set up a recovery fund for use after the crisis is over. The German finance minister, Olaf Scholz, said the agreement showed Europe's strength and solidarity. His Italian counterpart called it an excellent result, but said that Rome would continue to fight for the EU to go further. The South Korean city of Daegu, the centre of the country's coronavirus epidemic, has recorded no new cases for the first time since the outbreak began. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed. Yemen has reported its first coronavirus case in the east of the country. Aid groups have warned that the virus could be catastrophic for Yemen's war-ravaged healthcare system. An agreement by oil-exporting countries to reduce production has suffered a setback, with Mexico reluctant to take its share of the cuts. OPEC nations and Russia had tentatively agreed to slash output by 10 million barrels a day. New York has started to bury some of its dead in mass graves as the city's daily death rate from the outbreak continues to rise. Labourers have placed coffins in trenches on Hart Island. Detainees in Australia's immigration centres are asking the authorities to release them into the community after a case of COVID-19 was confirmed in a facility. The inmates say it's impossible to self-isolate, and some are on a hunger strike in protest. The government insists there are plans for dealing with such cases. And an international mission to Mercury is swinging past Earth in a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. It's due to go into orbit around Mercury in 5 years' time. BBC News.
Today on Business Daily, we're learning bad dance routines from the internet.
Say, ball, chain, kit, roll! Sexy kitten, reverse the one, reverse the one.
And following a rogue goat herd as it takes over a small Welsh village. Yep, we're looking at content that's taken the internet by storm during the coronavirus pandemic. Is this the meme's greatest moment yet?
A few goats running around a town and taking over when humans are not around anymore. That's the light relief we all need. We love it.
And as many of us work from home, why sharing humour with colleagues remotely can be more important than you might think.
People get enormous value from the social relationships and the social atmosphere at work. And so when they don't have it, as they don't now, they really miss it.
That's all coming up. A lighter look at what's keeping us laughing during difficult days. Business Daily with me, Vivienne Nunes, from the BBC.
Okay. Hi, I'm Andrew Stewart. I am now the Premier Goat Correspondent, I think kind of unofficial, for North Wales and the world.
Yep, Andrew reports on goats. Not normally, of course. Usually he's a reporter and video producer for the Manchester Evening News. But during the lockdown, he's been in Wales, documenting a herd of wild goats gradually encroaching on his parents' village. Andrew's been sharing that footage with the world via Twitter. So far, his goats have attracted 33 million page impressions. It's not often we get to cover goats gone wild on Business Daily, so we called him up to hear the shaggy tale.
It was one night when you look out of a pub window, which is definitely how all the best stories start. It was the pub that I'm staying in for lockdown, where my parents live. And I was in there one night, and you look out the window and there are a herd of about 10 or 15 goats just running down the middle of the street. They have been foraging around hedges and bushes, they've been climbing on walls, they've been causing havoc, just standing in the middle of the road. They are just having the time of their lives, running around all the streets. And then after they've had their little midnight feast, or as it is now, daytime feast as well, and when they've climbed on people's houses and stuff, they then go for a bit of a lie down when they can find like churchyards and stuff to just sit on, and socially distancing as well, so that's good.
Has anyone claimed the goats then? Any idea who owns them?
As goat correspondent, I don't really know too much about the goats at the moment, but I do know they are Kashmiri goats, and they were given to the town during the reign of Queen Victoria.
You didn't just keep these pictures to yourselves, you shared them on Twitter, and you continued to add to that thread over the coming days. What kind of response have you had to that?
Initially, I thought that it would just be, something that I thought was funny and then maybe liked by one or two people, or pretty much with all the other of my tweets just ignored. But no, people picked it up, and as I kept adding to it, a few big names, people with big followers, sort of picked up on the tweets and started sharing them around. It's gone absolutely global. Basically, it is the good news story that we really need at the moment. You've got stuff happening all the time, which is, our way of life has just changed massively in such a short space of time that a few goats running around a town and taking over when humans are not around anymore, that's the light relief we all need. We love it. It's hilarious, it's funny, it's also nature taking back control.
Andrew Stewart speaking to me from Wales. The goats of Llandudno aren't the only unlikely stars grabbing our attention online. For sports fans missing live matches, professional commentary from the supermarket aisle.
Will you join me live at Middle Class Arena? Ollie and Sally O'Connell, trolley and basket. Southeast halloumi buying champions last year, but work to do. Sue Wilson here, such a tricky event this. The crudité conundrum. Gone with a slab of pâté there, that's a safe choice. But so many hummuses in the modern game.
And there's #Isolation11, fantasy football teams made up of household items.
First up, the manager, Jurgen Mopp. In goal, I've got the Aston Villa keeper.
Millions of people watched and shared the Marsh family's rendition of One Day More from Les Miserables.
Another day, another destiny, shopping for online delivery. I've tried again only to find there's nothing till September time. One day more. How can I play when we are parted? One day more.
Despite that video being filmed in Kent, about an hour away from where I'm sitting, I was sent it by friends in Australia, hours after it went online. Meanwhile, this Nigerian video about a man receiving a call from his mistress while in lockdown with his wife was shared with a friend in Uganda.
Huh? Why are you sounding like this? Is your wife there?
Yes. God is all.
One of the funniest bits of content I've seen since being in lockdown is actor Joe Tracini dancing around his garden in an unflattering leotard.
7, 8, mantis, slide, bull, change, starfish, shoulder inversion, tiramisu, wait.
We'll be hearing from Joe a little later. But first, let's find out what's going on here. Have we simply got more time on our hands during lockdown to scroll through our phones? Or is there something else going on? With so many worries about the health emergency and an uncertain future for many businesses, are we more in need of a laugh than ever? Loretta LaRoche is an author and stress management consultant. She's 80 years old and has spent the last 3 decades specialising in humour as a coping mechanism.
You have to laugh. Laughter is actually a resilience technique because humor is a way of looking at life with perspective. You know, like, oh yeah, that wasn't so bad. You know, okay, we can get through it. Did you see that funny outfit that person had on? You know, it's like just being able to see some absurdity somewhere. There is some absurdity going on, don't you think?
Anyone who's been washing bananas in the sink, as I have been lately, would have to agree. But the news at the moment is pretty overwhelming. So what does Loretta suggest for managing stress during the coronavirus pandemic?
I think one of the most important things that we all need to do is not to make it worse than it is. It's already worse. So by catastrophizing and awfulizing, increasing the veracity of the situation to the point where it feels that you have no solutions, really is something that you can help yourself with. We have 60,000 thoughts a day, and a lot of them aren't rational. So sometimes you need a guide. Maybe you have a friend that's a little more pragmatic than you are, and you say, what do you think's going to happen? Is this the end? Are we in an apocalypse? What's happening? And that friend might say, now look, hold on. We've survived a lot of things as a human race, and we will get through this. So having a good buddy to help you makes sense. One who's rational, not one who says, oh yeah, you think this is bad? You haven't seen anything yet. That was my Sicilian mother. There is always a bless in the mess. And is there something here that you can find that's going to allow you to get through this?
Stress management expert Loretta LaRoche. Staying active can also help ward off negativity. Joe Tracini is an actor and now, possibly, the internet's favourite man in Lycra. His Twitter dance tutorial has been watched 20 million times in a week. Some people have even been inspired to send in their own videos, performing Joe's routine.
Sexy kitten, reverse the worm, reverse the worm, reverse the worm.
So what does Joe make of the response he's had to his backyard performance?
It's been ridiculous, Vivian.
I don't understand. I know, to be fair, people haven't got much on, and I am aware of that. But they, I don't know. The last I knew, they had 20 million hits across the world, which is ridiculous, given that I was just trying to stop myself going more mental than I already am. It's been lovely.
If there's anyone out there who is listening who hasn't yet come across these videos, can you paint us a picture, describe exactly what you do in them and where you are?
Well, I am in my girlfriend's garden, and it is lovely. And there were so many sort of people that are being really inspiring and getting people to stay active doing sort of dance tutorials. And I can't dance. So I thought it would be quite fun for me to do the dance tutorials as well, but just from an angle of somebody that can only just stand up, let alone move to a rhythm.
I'm not sure you can't dance. I mean, people might not have heard of those moves like tiramisu, filet mignon, who's at the door, Jeremy Irons. I mean, they may not be well-known moves, but I think a lot of people would think you can dance.
I appreciate that.
You have had training.
I have. Ironically, technically, I've had training. I didn't turn up much, but I was there for 3 years.
You have tweeted a lot in the past about mental health challenges.
Yes.
How do you see this period at the moment? Because there are a lot of people out there who probably aren't feeling that great. The news can be pretty overwhelming at the moment. How important is it for people to have light relief?
I'm on the relatively high end of the mental health problem sort of spectrum anyway, because I've got personality disorders. So if I don't laugh, I'm knackered. So I always make fun of myself. I tell my girlfriend, I tell my family that we all make fun and light of the sort of seriousness of what goes on in my head, because if I don't laugh about it, I haven't got what is a coping mechanism for me. And I'm also dancing like an absolute idiot because it takes my mind off of what is happening.
Joe Trissini. Sharing laughter with colleagues is one of the upsides of office environments. In-jokes between teams can not only lighten stressful working days, but also help us bond. Margaret Heffernan, a well-known writer, entrepreneur and expert in the workplace, explains why it's still as important as ever to reach out, even when we are physically distant.
People get in social connections to people are what will keep them dedicated to the business because they're dedicated to each other.
Is there any sort of advice in terms of how people could combat stress and improve mental health in the workplace, at home?
I think sing-alongs are brilliant. I think rewriting popular songs are brilliant. I have cocktails with my best friends on certain nights of the week now, and we share cocktail recipes and have the same cocktail as we're catching up. I would say, and this may be personal, I would say phone people instead of writing emails. I'm drowning in emails, and I just think there's a lot more human communication if you can phone people.
Loretta LaRoche has this idea for livening up your next online meeting.
Maybe you advocate for one of your meetings, you all wear a costume. That might be fun. A costume that reflects some of who you are as a personality. You know, maybe you're a control freak. Go put on a little helmet. If you're a perfectionist, wear a cape.
I would love that for the Business Daily team to wear costumes.
Wouldn't that be fun? What the heck?
It's clear the video conference is a medium ripe for comedy. We asked Business Daily's friend and comedian Colmo Regan for his reflections on a profession that many of us need now more than ever.
There's nothing like a global emergency to let you know exactly how necessary you are, and comedy is definitely on the nice-to-have list in the hierarchy of needs. Still though, people like to laugh, and I have enough ego to think I must answer my country's call. People want a release from the unrelenting bad news. It doesn't have to be a distraction, it can be about the bad news. It's like at a funeral. The death itself is not funny, but still some of the heartiest laughs you'll ever have will happen during a eulogy. They say comedy is tragedy plus time, but bad timing is tragic. Humour in serious times is a tricky thing to get right. However, the same rules apply regardless. Punch up, punch sideways, or punch yourself. If a subject is tragic, find the humour in the reactions, the juxtapositions, the unusual situations that we all find ourselves in. Because there are plenty of things that a huge amount of people are experiencing right now, often in an online community. Technology has been one of the big stories of this pandemic. We have probably finally scooped up the last of the late adopters to WhatsApp, and these new WhatsAppers, often among our parents' and grandparents' generation, have been sometimes enthusiastic in their sharing of fake cures and bad advice. So Generation X and Millennials can feel like the responsible ones. And then there's Zoom. It has been said that the only way to make money during a gold rush is to sell shovels. Well, Zoom have provided us with so many ways to dig ourselves into a hole. I did my first online Zoom gig on Wednesday night. Having done a couple of Edinburgh Fringe festivals in my day, performing in front of no visible audience was never going to be too daunting. Online gigs have other considerations, like your background. I don't mean socioeconomic, although that indirectly affects it. I mean your literal background. None of us imagined that our houses, our spare rooms, our cupboards under the stairs would be theatrical sets and conference venues. I've Googled the best images of bookshelves that I can find to put on my virtual Zoom background, and as long as I don't wave my arms around too much, some people in my online audience might even believe I've read both Thomas Piketty's book Capital and James Joyce's Ulysses. The children's bedtime was delayed slightly because Daddy was talking to people on the computer, sometimes swearing at people on the computer. The chat function was open during the Zoom gig. It was weird seeing an audience react silently. Again, though, Edinburgh prepares you for that. Now I've heard that there may be security issues around the Zoom platform, which makes me glad I had a virtual background. I didn't want hackers seeing discarded underpants on the ground. Like all sectors, this pandemic begs one question. When all of this is over, will things in the humour industry ever be the same again?
Colmo Regan. That's all for this edition of Business Daily from me and Sarah Trenor. Next week, Manuela will be presenting Global Money Box. We'd like to know how the financial fallout of the coronavirus lockdown is affecting you. How are you coping? What government support is available where you live? If you'd like to contribute to a program on this topic, please email your experiences and thoughts to moneybox@bbc.co.uk.
And now, the BBC World Service, it's time for Witness History with me, Alex Last. And today, as we deal with life in lockdown, we look back to a pioneering experiment in home online shopping almost 40 years ago.
We were doing something which today is so commonplace, but back then was so new. We were, in a sense, 15 to 20 years ahead of our time.
Our story begins not in Silicon Valley, but in the town of Gateshead in northeast England in 1984. There, Mrs. Jane Snowball, a 72-year-old grandmother, sat in an armchair in her house and picked up a small, square, chunky TV remote control. She pressed a few keys on the remote and her TV screen began to fill with text. It was a list of goods on offer at her local Tesco supermarket. By pressing buttons on the remote, she ordered eggs, cornflakes and margarine. It was the start of a pioneering online shopping experiment years ahead of the internet.
Mrs. Snowball never saw a computer. Never. Mrs. Snowball saw a television. Her connection to the television was a TV remote.
The system was created by Michael Aldridge, head of the technology firm Rediffusion, later called Rock. In 2013, he spoke to the BBC.
What effectively we did was to take a domestic television in a home and turn it into a computer terminal.
I know when to go out. I know when to stay.
Probably at that stage, in the early 80s, Mr. Joe Public had never seen a computer. They were used to their televisions, hence that was a good medium to use.
John Phelan then worked for Mr. Aldridge at Rediffusion. He designed the application that Mrs. Snowball used.
Yeah, I think it kind of made people sit up and go, okay, so something here that's has worked.
The origin of all this was rooted in a new technology that was pioneered in Britain by the Post Office in the 1970s, called view data, or videotex in other forms.
One of Britain's best inventions in a long time, view data.
View data, or videotex, is a new medium which is being pioneered in the British Post Office.
The revolutionary idea was that an ordinary television set could be used to display pages of information from a computer. All that was needed was to link the computer to the TV. The telephone system was the answer. It could carry both the chattering of the human voice and the electronic chatter of computers.
The idea was to create a simple-to-use interactive information service which allowed pages of text to be downloaded from a central database to a TV set or a dedicated terminal using the existing phone network. The viewer could select what pages they wanted to see just by pressing buttons on a TV remote control or keyboard and interact with the database.
Well, say I'm going out tonight. Press 3. To a restaurant. Press 2. What sort of food do you fancy? Well, we'll say French. So you select your restaurant and ask for the menu.
And private IT companies realized that this kind of technology could be adapted, made more interactive and tailored to specific commercial uses. One of those at the forefront was Michael Aldridge, and his firms soon started selling their own interactive videotex systems to businesses. But from the outset, Michael Aldridge saw how simple videotex pages could be used for shopping from home. He designed an online shopping system by connecting a TV with a special modem chip via a phone line to computers which could process the transactions in real time. But many were sceptical.
When Mike first came up with this idea, the press initially were very much, well, it's a bit like one of those episodes out of Star Trek at the time. Maybe they didn't take him really that seriously.
But around the same time, in the early 1980s, a community project had begun in Gateshead, a deprived area of high unemployment over the river from Newcastle. The town's libraries, the local university and the council had come up with a plan to help the elderly, the disabled and the vulnerable order their shopping without having to travel into the city centre. First, they connected libraries and community centres via computer to the local supermarket, a popular bakery, Greggs, and Lloyd's Pharmacy. The final stage was to provide technology for those actually confined to their homes. Michael Aldridge and Rediffusion saw a chance to prove their system worked.
The revolution has already begun. On Tyneside, the residents of Gateshead have found a public library converted into an extension to the local supermarket, without the crush. One day, it seems, everyone will have the chance to shop this way without leaving home, as well as talking back through their monitors in a whole range of ways.
It saves wear and tear on yourself, and I think it saves money in the long run.
I think well before the end of this decade, we'll see large numbers of the population, or at least those who wish to do so, doing their shopping from their homes.
Michael Aldridge instructed John Phelan to work on the Gateshead project.
It's never been done before. We don't have any templates that say this is the best way to do it. It's a challenge for you. Think outside the box. Picture in your mind what a shopping system would look like that would then be a service to the elderly and infirm people, obviously in homes.
Now, it's worth remembering that at the time, home computers were extremely rare, and for many people, digital technology was completely new, regarded as something rather complex and intimidating. The big challenge was how to create a digital system that someone, for example, a 72-year-old grandmother, could easily use. That was the beauty of videotex. As for the user, there was no computer. It was just a TV.
The most they ever saw was a television set, an adapted television set. So straight away, they were at home, they were familiar. The input mechanism, so they didn't have keyboards, they had a television remote handset.
And when it came to designing the pages for the shopping service, John Phelan had to come up with terms to make things more understandable. Some we might recognise today.
My main thing was using what people could relate to. So a shopping basket was the type of terminology that I used.
72-year-old grandmother could easily use. That was the beauty of video
shopping list, as opposed to trying to be techie about it and say, hey, here is a list of your items.
John Phelan then went around installing the system in old people's homes and in private houses and gave people a quick crash course in how it worked.
It was all, how can I put it, very excitable. Yes, there was hesitance and slight resistance at the beginning, because obviously anything new, it was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to like this. But once they actually saw it, after a few minutes, 5 minutes of training, and you're off. It's surprising, even these elderly people, it was hard to really put into words how easily they just seem to be able to use the system. So straight away,
the experiment proved so successful, it was also adopted in the town of Bradford.
It was a tremendous success. They were familiar. It went on national TV. There was a lot of praise of the industry about what had actually happened. It opened a lot of other.
Not least because their interactive, simple-to-use system could be tailored for other services.
They
designed similar versions for big businesses, and those systems were used for years. But for the general public in Britain, designing data and video text systems didn't really take off, perhaps because of the limitations and expense of the technology. Though in France, a similar system was in nationwide use for decades. Still, the advent of modern online shopping service, John Phelan had to come up with terms to make things more understandable. But John Phelan is still proud of what they achieved back in the 1980s.
It was years before its time, but for me, I can look back and say,
we might recognise
without
today.
a shadow of a doubt, my main was a success. And it was just a sense of delight that was using it did actually people could relate to.
John Phelan ending this edition of Witness History with me, Alex Lars.
So a shopping basket.
For more of our history programmes, just search online for 72-year-old grandmother history.
And for more technology stories, you can hear World Wise Web, where teenagers from around the world talk to the inventors and designers who have shaped their lives, from the iPod and GPS to Google search and the mobile phone.
What was it like?
This thing is huge. The battery life, if you start talking, is only 20 minutes. It turns out that wasn't a problem. This thing is so heavy, you can't hold it up for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Go to bbcworldservice.com/worldwiseweb.
And in 60 Minutes, The Real Story with Ritu Lachin. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to some of the weakest central governments on Earth. So how will health systems cope if there's a widespread outbreak of coronavirus? Can workers adapt? How badly could COVID-19 affect Africa? On air, online and on smartphone, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 8 a.m. GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Charlotte Gallagher. We'll hear how a feud between politicians in Japan is causing confusion over a lockdown in Tokyo. There's positive news from South Korea, from the city which was the centre of the country's coronavirus outbreak. Also,
I thought that I would be safe here, that I put crisis behind me, but this has told me that we are not safe, no matter where we are. It's a humbling experience to be there with the NHS workers who are doing everything in their power to fight this pandemic.
The Syrian refugee who's joined the fight against coronavirus in his adopted home country, and how football across the world is looking at ways to get back onto the pitch.
There'll be an enormous determination for football clubs to get this season done, because obviously in terms of TV rights it causes all sorts of legal problems.
That's all to come in the next half an hour. First, a news bulletin.
BBC News, hello, this is Jerry Smith. There's been a broad welcome for the coronavirus emergency package EU finance ministers agreed late on Thursday. The deal will make $500 billion available immediately and set up a recovery fund for use once the crisis is over. Here's our Europe regional editor, Mike Sanders.
It took 16 hours of wrangling, and the putative deal still has to be signed off by EU leaders. But the pledge of huge sums has won praise, some of it effusive. Our faith in Europe has proven correct, tweeted the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli. His fellow Italian, the Finance Minister Roberto Gualtieri, called it an excellent result. But the corona bonds Italy wanted the EU to issue to share the debt have been killed off by German and Dutch opposition.
A range of new measures are being introduced in the Japanese capital, Tokyo, to battle rising cases of COVID-19. Some businesses, such as cinemas and internet cafes, will have to temporarily shut down. Others will have reduced hours. Bars and restaurants will be required to close their doors by 8 p.m. The South Korean city of Daegu, which was the centre of the country's coronavirus epidemic, has recorded no new cases for the first time since the outbreak began 2 months ago. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed. Laura Bicker reports from Seoul.
No new reported cases of coronavirus in the city of Daegu is good news, but health officials have issued a stark warning ahead of the Easter weekend. They're concerned about large church services, and the Prime Minister has urged religious groups to refrain from mass gatherings. Meanwhile, South Koreans are heading to the polls, which have opened for 2 days of early voting ahead of the parliamentary elections next week. All voters are advised to wear masks, they'll have their temperature checked and be kept at least 1 metre apart from others while waiting to cast their ballot.
An agreement by oil exporting countries to reduce production has hit a snag, with Mexico reluctant to take its share of the cuts. OPEC nations and Russia had tentatively agreed to curb output to counter the slump in demand. Discussions will continue today as energy ministers from the G20 discuss further steps. Samir Hashmi reports.
The contours of the deal agreed by OPEC Plus include reducing supply by 10 million barrels per day in May and June, which translates to roughly about 10% of global supplies. The curbs will then be eased gradually until April 2022. But the agreement hinges on Mexico joining in the cuts. The focus has now shifted to the G20 energy ministers' virtual meeting. Saudi Arabia and Russia want oil producers outside the OPEC Plus group to also contribute to the cuts. They will use the G20 meeting as an opportunity to convince the United States and Canada to join the deal.
BBC News. Yemen has reported its first coronavirus case in the east of the country. The emergency committee, run by the internationally recognised government, said the infected patient was in a stable condition and receiving care. Aid groups have warned that the virus could have a catastrophic impact on Yemen's healthcare system, which has been ruined by war. Detainees in Australia's immigration centres are asking the authorities to release them into the community after a case of COVID-19 was confirmed at one facility. Inmates say it's impossible to self-isolate, and some say they're on hunger strike. The government says there are plans for dealing with cases within its detention network. New York has started to bury some of its dead in mass graves as the city's daily death rate from the virus continues to rise. And an international mission to Mercury is swinging past the Earth on a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. The European-Japanese Bepi Colombo mission is taking a circuitous route to reach its destination, as our reporter Jonathan Amos explains.
You could go direct to Mercury and reach it in just months if you wanted. The gravity of our star would pull you in, but then you wouldn't be able to stop, not without an enormous rocket engine. And Bepi Colombo wants to orbit the little world and study it up close. So this joint European-Japanese venture is skipping past the planets, Earth, Venus and Mercury itself, using their gravitational attraction as a way to put a foot on the brake. It's a circuitous route of billions of kilometres, but it means Bepi will be travelling at just the right speed to finally insert itself alongside Mercury in 2025.
That was a report from Jonathan Amos. And those are the latest stories from BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Charlotte Gallagher. Early voting in parliamentary elections is taking place in South Korea. It's a sign that a country which once had the largest number of coronavirus cases outside China has managed to contain the outbreak. The epicentre of the disease, the city of Daegu, has just announced no new cases, and there were just 27 across the country. But voters are wearing masks, gloves and having their temperature checked. After a delay, the new school year has also begun, but that too has been adapted. Pupils are attending via their living rooms and bedrooms, as Laura Bicker reports.
Hi.
This is not how Miss Ha wanted to greet her first-year students.
Kim Min-seo, are you in the classroom? Let's see. All right. I see your face. Would you like to share your story?
Normally, she'd write her name on the blackboard. Instead, she has to scribble it on her phone. It's then transferred online onto her screen and her students' laptops.
Starting school online is very weird and sometimes not like real school. And I hope we can meet at school soon.
I know. At first, I was so nervous and even scared because I've never used these technologies before.
South Korea had hoped to crush the coronavirus outbreak in time for the start of the new school year. It has come close. The start of the school year had been delayed by 5 weeks, so the government couldn't hold off much longer. It decided to start classes online.
Okay, can you show your face too? Now let me show you a map indicating those English-speaking countries. Can you see the screen now?
Miss Yu tells me she can check her students' work in real time to ensure they are indeed studying. But learning to work in a virtual classroom in just a few days has been a real challenge.
It's overwhelming. It feels so awkward to talk in an empty classroom.
The government is handing out over 300,000 smart devices. There are huge digital gaps to fill even in this tech-savvy country. The biggest worry is for students sitting the notorious college entrance exam later this year.
중간고사랑 기말고사를 저희가 예정대로 봐야 하잖아요.
As the opening of school got pushed back again and again, it dawned on us, what could happen to our midterms and finals? These tests are the final stage to prep for our college entrance. What could happen if we cannot take these exams?
계속 들은 소식이 막 중간고사가 없어진다?
Che Yoon-jung is already under a lot of pressure. The college entrance exam is one of the toughest tests in the world and involves an entire day of back-to-back examinations.
수행평가로 대체한다. 이게 진짜 저는 너무 어이가 없었던 게.
Yeah, they started talking about substituting it with a progress review. I was really panicking.
Yoo Soo-ha may be confident, but the fear is that some students without support at home get left behind. Some charities are organising food deliveries along with tech support. Concentrating on a screen for so long will be difficult for many, but Miss Yu is determined.
It is extraordinary that schools are opening online. In a way, we are making a step forward to another revolution in the educational system. I find it actually cool that I'm a part of it.
The government admits this online school is an experiment. But in a year where normal life has become a distant dream, this is as close as pupils can get for now.
That was Laura Bicker in South Korea. And if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in that country, follow Laura on Twitter. A range of new measures are being introduced in the Japanese capital, Tokyo, to battle rising cases of COVID-19. Some businesses, such as cinemas and restaurants, will have to temporarily shut down. The measures were announced by the governor of Tokyo, who's for some time wanted to introduce stricter restrictions than the central government, which is worried about the economy. The latest measures were announced following talks between the governor and government officials. And our Asia Pacific editor, Michael Bristow, joins me now. So, Michael, I imagine these discussions were pretty fraught.
Yeah, they were, and it reveals a difference of opinion between governors of big cities and regions and the central government, a kind of disagreement you don't see really in other countries which are fighting COVID-19. Yuriko Koike, the governor of Tokyo, for some weeks has been trying to introduce stricter restrictions. And as you mentioned there, negotiations on Thursday evening with the central government, they've agreed to allow her to do that. Some places will close down entirely, such as cinemas, internet cafes. Other places, such as bars, will have restricted openings. Bars, for example, will have to stop serving alcohol by 8 p.m. But at a press conference held by the Japanese governor, you get a sense of some of the frustration she feels with the central government, which is worried about the effect on the economy. She said, she thought being a governor would be akin to being a CEO, but she felt more like a middle management. So clear evidence there that there is quite a lot of disagreement between the central government and at the very least, the Tokyo governor.
And are people there worried that these measures have come in a bit too late?
It's difficult to tell in Japan because until now they've had a relatively few amount of cases, just over 5,000, and it was one of the first countries outside of China to report any cases at all. So that's maybe lulled the population, lulled the government into a false sense of security. Now, over the last week or so, that's started to change. There have been a rising number of cases, hence the call by the Tokyo government for the Tokyo governor for stricter restrictions. Even now, though, there's a limit on exactly how much these restrictions can be enforced. There's no rules, for example, to stop, to punish people who don't abide by the rules. So at the moment, Japan is still grappling with whether or not it should change its response to the coronavirus.
And you mentioned there about the rules being difficult to enforce. And is that something to do with the constitution of Japan?
It certainly is, yes. Since the Second World War, Japan has had a pacifist constitution, essentially brought in to limit the central government's actions in telling its people what to do. And there's no, for example, a state of emergency cannot be declared under the constitution. The government can only advise. So the state of emergency declared earlier this week by the central government had to be brought in following the introduction of a new law, temporary law, to allow that to happen. So certainly it's created a debate within Japan of whether the constitution, whether the government structure is basically fit for purpose to deal with a crisis such as this one. And some of those issues are being played out now in this disagreement between the central government and regional leaders.
Michael, thank you. That was Michael Bristow. European Union finance ministers have agreed a $500 billion rescue package for countries hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic. It's designed to help workers, firms and governments struggling with the impact of the disease. The deal was announced by the Portuguese finance minister, Mario Centineo, who's also president of the Eurogroup of EU countries.
We would strive to make this pandemic crisis support operational within 2 weeks. They add up to around €500 billion, a step change in the economic coordination within our union. This emergency plan will shield our economic and social fabric as we dive into a recession.
But behind the scenes, divisions remain. Gavin Lee is our Europe correspondent.
There are critics, the Dutch, the Italians, the Spanish, who say privately, they're diplomats, that this is a German vision in some ways. This helps German industries, particularly for employees. What about tourism in Spain, for example? What about those in the cultural sector? Some of the programmes aren't necessarily designed that way. So there is something going on behind the scenes. But ultimately, the other point here, they agreed on this bailout package. It has to be endorsed now by the leaders. We expect an emergency virtual summit, an online summit next week. They didn't agree on the key thing, which was a mutual sharing of debt, a loans or an IOU system where they take a collective responsibility for each other. It was labelled Corona bonds. That was absolutely toxic. What's in a name? An awful lot. That's out of the window. I'm told by the Dutch, complete no-go.
Gavin Lee, you're listening to the BBC World Service, and Jerry has the headlines.
EU member states have agreed a rescue package to help countries affected by coronavirus. Germany says the $500 billion deal demonstrates European solidarity. The governor of Tokyo is asking a range of businesses to close their doors in a bid to halt the spread of the pandemic in Japan. And the city at the centre of the outbreak in South Korea has reported no new cases for the first time in 2 months.
Thanks, Jerry. For Christians all over the world, Easter is the most important festival of the year. But coronavirus means that the usual celebrations and events will have to change. When Pope Francis leads the service of the Stations of the Cross in St. Peter's Square this evening, he'll be assisted at a safe distance by doctors and nurses from the Vatican Healthcare Department. Let's now talk to our global religion reporter, Lebu Deseko. So today is Good Friday, but how has coronavirus affected all the traditional services?
Well, as you mentioned, the Pope there really leading by example. He has taken all of his, he's been doing all of his liturgy this week without a congregation physically there, and he's taken those online for people to join him on the internet, and that's what he will be doing over this weekend as well. But it has been very difficult for a lot of people who have been unable to go to their normal services. I was connecting with people in South Africa saying that, you know, they've gone into lockdown, they've been in lockdown for quite some time, and they're having to adjust to also, you know, going online. Their churches are streaming services, but they miss that physical togetherness. I spoke to a lady in Kenya earlier this week who was planning to have Good Friday communion with her church community via Zoom. So people are trying to find ways to connect with each other. And in New York, I know that churches are planning to get people to come out onto their balconies and sing on Easter Sunday, which is the most holy day of the year for Christians.
So people still managing to stay connected. And it's also the Jewish festival of Passover. And has coronavirus had any effect on how that's been celebrated across the world?
Well, yeah, a big part of Passover is the first evening, if you're in Israel, first and second evening, if you're outside of Israel, for many Jewish people, is the Seder ceremony or the Seder ritual meal where families gather together with friends round a table and really remember the story of how the Jews were led out of slavery in Egypt and led to their freedom. And it's about community. It's about coming together. And not being able to do that was very difficult for many people. Again, in Israel, people did try and find ways to still find that togetherness. Some people going out into their gardens, their balconies, and singing parts of that ceremony. I also spoke with a rabbi in New York who was really trying to encourage people to find ways to take parts of the ritual and adapt them for the time that we're in. So people are trying to still, find a way of being together and still conduct their religious ceremonies.
Lebu, thank you. That was Lebu Deseko. Detainees in Australian immigration centres are pleading to be released because they're frightened they might catch the virus. Inmates say it's impossible for them to self-isolate and protect themselves. Some have now gone on hunger strike. There has been one confirmed case of the virus in the detention network so far. Almost 1,500 people are being held in detention on the mainland. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Oh, this is what the government doesn't want. The people to congregate together like this, shoulder to shoulder.
Detainees at the Villawood Immigration Centre in Sydney fear an outbreak of the new coronavirus inside the facility would be impossible to control. They're pleading to be released into the community. Some say they're so desperate they've gone on a hunger strike.
We're not going to break or wreck anything, but this is the only form of way that we can reach out is by striking like this, to don't eat in order to get some form of attention.
Don't eat, no drink.
No eat, no drink. We're sick of being in the dark and being in the shadows. We are human beings. So we urge you, we're pleading with the Australian government to act now. The time is now, before it gets here and it's too late.
In a letter to the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, detainees insist they're living in a potential COVID-19 death trap.
We ask the community and the Prime Minister and the lawyers to help our family and help us before the disease coming inside the detention and sweep everybody.
This COVID-19 virus, it's taken you out there. If it hits in here like it is already, the rumours are, we're all gone. We're all going to die. We just get buried with nothing. They might as well just come and shoot a lot of us now.
The government insists there are established plans for dealing with a potential coronavirus outbreak within Australia's detention network. A spokesperson said detainees showing symptoms of COVID-19 would be quarantined and tested.
Next, it's now a month since sport around the world began to get disrupted by coronavirus. This year's Olympics, Wimbledon tennis and the British Open golf have either been postponed or cancelled, but plans are being formulated to restart the football season as quickly as possible. And Nigel Adderley joins me in the studio. What are the main motivations for the football authorities? Cynically, I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Much of it does come down to money because many of the main leagues in Europe have huge television contracts which provide much of the club's turnover. And the broadcast companies are reluctant to pay the fuller value of the contracts because they're not showing any live football and they don't get to cover the conclusion of the season. And the president of La Liga in Spain, Javier Tebas, claims a failure to complete the season will cost their clubs around $1.1 billion collectively, and the English Premier League could also risk losing revenue of around £1 billion from their television companies, and a couple of clubs have already said they could go bust if they lose out on their share of the pie. And there is also the issue of sporting integrity, because if seasons are ended prematurely, what happens to those clubs at the top and bottom of various leagues? And bearing this in mind, the former Barcelona player and now broadcaster Gary Lineker thinks there is a collective effort to play on.
I think there'll be an enormous determination for football clubs to get this season done, because obviously in terms of TV rights it causes all sorts of legal problems if they want their money back because they're not shown the remainder of the league. And obviously it would also be the fairest thing if we could finish this season. So I think they will try and come back, probably behind closed doors at first, just to try and get the season finished. And then obviously they could almost go straight into next season. Football has to, like many other sports and many other areas of life, it just has to wait and see.
I know, we need this to happen because Leeds United have got to go up. Selfishly, that's my main concern at the moment. Now, is there any indication about when the leagues might restart?
Not really, because it's difficult for them, because they can plan resumptions, but areas might still be on lockdown because a date of May the 28th was given as a potential time to resume in Spain. But that seems impossible because many people in certain areas still can't leave their homes. So it's more likely to be towards the end of June. And a potential scenario discussed in Italy was to play all of the remaining Serie A games in Rome and host the teams in quarantined areas. But they're not ruling out finishing the current season as late as October, while in Germany, they're hoping to resume maybe in early May, but they're also saying that fans won't be let back into the stadiums there until January at the earliest.
But people might be surprised to hear that football is going on still in some places.
Yes, there is football this weekend in Belarus, Burundi, Nicaragua and Tajikistan, because attitudes to COVID-19 in those nations do appear to be slightly different to those in many other areas. And of course, as a result, because there is nothing else going on, interest in those leagues is now growing.
I can imagine. Nigel, thank you very much. Now, Jerry has some other stories from our news desk.
Singapore is taking steps to combat a spike in coronavirus cases among migrant workers living in cramped dormitories. Army camps, floating hotels and vacant public housing blocks are being used to rehouse workers and allow social distancing. The move follows the confirmation of nearly 300 new cases of the virus, most of them related to migrant workers. In the United States, the former head of a federal global health unit that was disbanded by President Trump has criticised the country's approach to tackling the pandemic. Beth Cameron said the Trump administration was still failing to implement a clear strategy.
I think that individual states, obviously in the United States, have a lot of authority, and we're hearing a lot of leadership from governors, from local officials who are dealing with this. But at the end of the day, we basically have to manage this with a unified plan, or else we're not going to be able to get ahead of it and really beat it.
Government figures from Hungary show the country has experienced its largest daily increase in cases of the disease. Official data showed 210 confirmed new cases. On Thursday, Hungary's nationwide lockdown was extended indefinitely by the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's now ruling by decree. And the British government says the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in the early phase of his recovery from coronavirus after he was moved out of intensive care last night. Mr. Johnson is continuing to receive treatment in hospital in London. It's not clear when he'll be able to return to full-time work.
Thanks, Jerry. In 2015, Hassan Akkad arrived in London after fleeing Syria, where he'd been jailed by the authorities. He filmed his journey for the BBC, crossing from Turkey to Greece in an overcrowded dinghy, and the film Exodus went on to win a British Film Award. Now safe in London, he wanted to give something back and was desperate to help in the coronavirus outbreak. In Damascus, he was a teacher, but he's now working as a cleaner in a hospital. He's been speaking to the BBC's Alan Kasuja.
I did a simple Google search and I found out that my local hospital where I live in East London was desperate for cleaners. I heard that nurses and medical doctors are getting the virus and I thought disinfecting and cleaning the hospital would both help the medical staff and help the patients to be in a clean and disinfected environment. So my shift is 8 hours long. And it's pretty physically demanding, to be honest, because putting the PPE makes you sweat, makes you out of breath. And I'm disinfecting and cleaning around the clock.
Do you have any sort of interaction at all with the patients or not?
I do, yes, because now some of them are familiar. So when I walk in, I say good morning to everyone, and they are going through difficult times, but they managed to have a smile on some of them managed to have a smile on their faces, and some of them start telling me how much they wish to get through this and get back to their families. It's a tough environment. It's intense, but I think everyone is being supportive of one another to get through this.
And I wonder, you've been through war. How has this, what is this experience like in terms of lessons learned?
Lessons learned is that no one is safe. When I came to Britain, I thought that I would be safe here, that I put crisis behind me. But this has taught me something. It taught me that we are not safe, no matter where we are. And it's a humbling experience to be there with the NHS workers who are doing everything in their power to fight this pandemic.
That was Hassan Akkad, just one of the many people that are trying to help in this situation. You've been listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Charlotte Gallagher. And before we go, let's bring you an update on the latest on the coronavirus outbreak. The number of deaths from COVID-19 across the world is approaching 100,000. Christians marking Good Friday are being urged to stay at home. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is out of intensive care. South Korea's Daegu, the centre of the country's outbreak, has reported no new cases for the first time. And Singapore has seen another sharp rise in cases, though the total remains relatively low. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing you the incredible story of the doomed Apollo 13 mission.
Friday, April 17th, 1970. This is the closing act of the mission of Apollo 13, NASA's aborted expedition to the moon. 4 days ago, their spacecraft was crippled by an explosion. Since then, Mission Control has battled round the clock just to keep the crew alive.
Looks like we've got about 40 minutes left in that tank. Okay, does it look like it's still going down? That's affirmative, yes.
Across the globe, millions of radios and television sets are tuned in to witness the astronauts' fate. The world is watching, waiting.
We're now coming to the last moments of Apollo 13 as it comes in, as it begins its re-entry. The best thing we can do now is just to listen and hope.
Apollo 13 with Kevin Fong. Listen to the whole series now at bbcworldservice.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is one of the holiest places on earth, Jerusalem. For centuries, it's been a magnet for Christian pilgrims. I'm Wasim Razouk, and today, many of those pilgrims make their way to my shop, Razouk Tattoo, to carry on the ancient tradition of getting an incredible souvenir of their visit to the Holy Land. It's also a profound statement of their faith. Hear their stories on Heart and Soul after the latest BBC headlines.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. EU member states have agreed a rescue package to help countries affected by coronavirus. Germany says the $500 billion deal demonstrates European solidarity. Italy's finance minister called it an excellent result, but said that Rome would continue to fight for the EU to go further. Italy wants debts incurred during the crisis to be shared between all member states. The governor of Tokyo is asking a range of businesses to close their doors in a bid to halt the spread of the pandemic in Japan. Yuriko Koike has, for the first time, wanted to introduce stricter restrictions than the central government. The city at the centre of the outbreak in South Korea has reported no new cases for the first time in 2 months. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed. Yemen's first case of the disease has been reported in the east of the country. 8 groups have warned the virus could be a catastrophe for a healthcare system ravaged by war. Energy ministers from the G20 group of countries will hold a video conference later to discuss steps to stabilise the oil market. A tentative deal to slash production by 10 million barrels a day was agreed by oil exporters on Thursday, though Mexico is reluctant to take its share of the cuts. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is reported to be in good spirits as he recovers from coronavirus. He was moved out of intensive care last night, but his father, Stanley, said there might have to be a period of adjustment before the Prime Minister could return to work. An international mission to Mercury is swinging past Earth in a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. It's due to go into orbit around Mercury in 5 years' time. And those are the latest stories from BBC News.
Hello, I'm Wasim Razouk and welcome to Heart and Soul from the BBC World Service at Razouk Tattoo, the last traditional religious pilgrimage tattoo business in the world. We're in the heart of Jerusalem, in the Christian quarter of the Old City. 700 years ago, according to our family legend, my ancestors began tattooing fellow Coptic Christians in Egypt. 500 years ago, we moved to Jerusalem and began offering the same service to the pilgrims here.
I have several tattoos from Wasim, and so I think about the people for all those centuries who have come and have worn this on their body as a sign of their faith. That's really amazing.
Everyone who comes here has a different story. With the help of my producer, Phil Pegham, we'll hear people explain the impact that Jerusalem has had on them and their reasons for marking their pilgrimage with a tattoo they'll never forget.
I'll always be a memory that God had some special times for me over here. These are the memories that I will continuously draw back on throughout the rest of my ministry, throughout the rest of my life.
Welcome to Razouk Tattoos, tattooing pilgrims since 1300. Anyone who wants to get a religious pilgrimage tattoo, come to us, because they know, and everybody knows, that we have been doing this tradition of tattooing pilgrims for hundreds of years, and we are considered to be the custodians of this tradition.
It's been handed down the generations. What generation are you then?
Well, according to our calculation, I am the 27th generation, 700 years of tattooing. I learned tattooing from my father, who learned tattooing from his father, who learned tattooing from his father. So it's always been kept in the family.
Coming inside here, it's actually quite small. It's almost like it seems going into a small cave. The entrance is quite narrow. It's only about 5 or 6 feet wide, and the stone at the side of the walls is exposed and curves overhead to quite a low ceiling. And in some ways it looks a bit like a museum. There's glass cabinets around with old photographs in them. And going further back, it opens out a bit more, and behind a built partition here is where Wasim does his tattoos. And it's still quite a small room, probably room for about 3 or 4 people. All his kit laid out on the tables, ready to start another day's work. Customers soon start arriving, and the parlour begins to fill with people flicking through the catalogues of designs and talking to Wasim about the tattoos they want.
Me being this person who's giving this tattoo is very honorable, and I feel it every time I do a tattoo, and I just have a couple of words with them and I talk to them, and
it makes the whole experience of that few minutes of tattooing very spiritual and intimate in many ways.
Do they share their stories with you, their decisions, their life?
This moment that they have come and sat in the seat and they are getting this tattoo is a result of probably an experience in life or a lifetime experience that has led them to this moment. And you need to be very careful with it.
Arm. It's what is the tradition? Left or right?
Left, right, whatever you feel like. It's more towards the right arm. The purpose of a pilgrimage tattoo was to show your tattoo every time you meet somebody, so that they can see that you've done your pilgrimage.
Okay.
So
It's
not
like sending them a T-shirt or sending them a cup of coffee or something like that. You're connecting with them. It has to be emotional to make that moment special for them, and of course for me. And that's a very important aspect of our work, is to connect with the client.
You're from England?
Yes, I am, yes. I'd like it, please, on my left forearm, if that's all right.
A small cross. That's what we'll do. This will be your first tattoo?
Yes.
If I may ask you, how old are you?
Have a guess.
I would say 70.
You're very polite. You're very polite. I'm 70 years plus a little more than what you've just quoted.
In fact, Frank Staples is 80.
My wife died 5 years ago. We used to travel quite a lot, and I've carried on much as before, and I can cope so far, touch wood.
Do you like the placement?
Spot on. Yes.
Good on.
He's getting a small cross on the inside of his left forearm. What do you think your wife would have made of it?
She would have been extremely surprised, but very supportive. I'm a Christian, so I go to church, and the season of Lent has just begun, and I had a wonderful experience yesterday walking the Stations of the Cross, which I've always sort of rather wanted to do.
I feel really honored to be the person who will mark them forever for such a great journey of life. It's not because they chose me to do a flower or a butterfly on them. They chose me to be the person who will mark them forever as new Christians, as people who have fell in love again with their faith, people who will go back and tell about their journey, about the story, and part of it will be the tattoo. But the tattoo is not what they're here for. They're here for marking themselves and reminding themselves of the new person that they have become. After you have felt the presence of God in a different way in the Holy Land, you become a different person in a way, a new person in a way.
Yeah.
And this will remind you forever of this experience. Or if someone sees it, they ask you, oh wow, what is that? And then you can start talking about your trip and about your faith and about Jesus, and it's
true.
And it's a certificate of your pilgrimage. Now you have a proof that you have been here.
Yeah, that's a good word, certificate.
George Milliman is getting his first tattoo. It's also his first visit to the Holy Land. He's 57 and a pastor at his church in Sturgis, Michigan, USA.
It has been very overwhelming with the facts. Seeing the actual place where Jesus had his feet, that's what I was searching for.
And this is another part of your pilgrim journey.
Because of my daughter.
Coming in?
Yes. Yes, she
So this is your daughter. What's your name?
Dana.
Why have you persuaded your father to have a tattoo here?
Well, he went with me the first time I got a tattoo, and I feel like he really wanted it, but he's always been nervous, so this is his first one. But I feel like it held more meaning for him to do it here.
Yes.
And what are you having tattooed here?
An olive tree.
And why have you chosen that?
The olive tree, there's so much depth with the olive tree. When it dies from the inside out. So that speaks spiritually to me, is that if I can keep my flesh from overcoming my spirit, the insides won't die.
So it's quite a decision to wait until you're 57 and then have a tattoo, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's the rest of my life. I'm going to have this thing. I'm not going to wash it off. So for me, this is definitely out of my comfort zone. as you can tell, being 57.
How do you think you'll use it in your ministry?
I think it will always be a memory that God had some special times for me over here. These are the memories that I will continuously draw back on throughout the rest of my ministry, throughout the rest of my life.
And when are you going back?
Tonight, actually, we get back on the plane tonight.
So this is sort of your final...
This is the grand finale. Yes, so make it good.
George and his daughter Dana are getting matching tattoos.
I wanted to do what he was doing. You know, he's been a big spiritual influence in my life. Having the same as my dad, I think, is the biggest part of it. One of the things that we've been doing is each day we go out and we have these tours and we learn so much that it's hard to retain everything. But we would come back and we would all sit down, the four of us three and my aunt, and just rehash everything that we learned. And those have been, I think, some good moments as a family. When you are vulnerable and spiritual with each other and you talk about it with other people, it just makes a deeper family connection.
And this tattoo will be part of that, even when you're old.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be there, isn't it?
Yeah, it will be. Yeah, this will be definitely a different tattoo than anything that I have.
Have you ever made a mistake?
Oh, gosh.
I just made 2 mistakes on you. On an olive tree like this, where can you see the mistakes? You don't know. It's all just...
There are no do-overs, man, so it's...
Your father asks some reassuring questions, doesn't he?
He asks when I'm getting my tattoo.
The tattoo design is transferred onto the skin with a stencil or stamp. Once the client's happy with it, Wasim goes over the lines in black ink with his tattoo machine. Most people only want a small one, and the whole process takes about 10 minutes.
I've chosen a stamp of Mary holding Jesus, and around it is written the words, "Lift up the lowly," and on the bottom it says, "Send the rich away."
And having that reconnecting with her faith and her spirit.
Life here definitely feels more real than it does at university in America. I think my experience at home is just like, I just feel like a brain attached to a laptop a lot of the time. It's all social media, it's all the internet. It's very hard to feel like you're a real human being, like with a body and a person and a community. And I think like having a physical mark is definitely something to treasure in like the world that acts like you don't have a body, or that your body is not important or way too important. Or
A tattoo is not just the stories of the place that you had the tattoo. It's the stories of the individual, the decision to have the tattoo. What stories will you tell people when you go back home about why you've had it?
I'll probably tell them a lot of stories about my friends at Bethlehem University, like my friend Adnan. We asked if he'd ever been shot with rubber bullets, and he laughed because he said, of course, and he's 20. And just realizing, like, life in America, it's like we think that it's normative to never have anything threaten your life, but that for so many people, like, around the world, I've started realizing that it's not normative. It creates a responsibility for me. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to get this tattoo.
How do you like it?
I think it's beautiful. Wow. Thank you so much.
I'm happy you like it.
I am Wasim Razouk, and you're listening to Heart and Soul on the BBC World Service at Razouk's Tattoo Shop in the heart of the Christian quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem.
Wasim Razouk's tattoo parlour is only just around the corner, about a minute away from the Jaffa Gate where I am now. This is one of the main tourist entrances to the Old City of Jerusalem. It's just before Easter, and normally at this time of year Jerusalem would be packed with pilgrims. This year, though, it's unusually quiet because of fears about the coronavirus. But for those who have made it, there's another, modern pilgrimage station that's often been added to their tour. Razouk Tattoos.
That man is an artist. Now, I'm afraid of him because he's dealing with needles. I'm afraid of needles. Never been in his place, but he is so well known all over the world. Then if you like tattoo, this is the man. And, he's blushing now. And can I say that you are a Coptic Christian?
Yep. Coptic.
Then he's a Coptic Christian, North Africa. I wanted to look at that. His family was here together with the Crusaders. And when the Crusaders went back to Europe, they used to come to his family, and they used to tattoo their Jerusalem cross on head, And when they went to Europe, they used to say hello like that. Sounds familiar?
Nah.
Yeah. Then, Wasim, enjoy your work.
Thank you.
And let's continue, please.
Can I take a photo, please?
Go ahead.
If you go back 1,000 years ago, no pilgrim would go back home without a tattoo. Since the moment I started working doing tattoos, that is exactly what I was hoping to reach, to the point where pilgrims will know about this tradition when they come to Jerusalem, to stop by the shop and get a cross here, their pilgrimage, just the way it used to be done 1,000 years ago.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a few minutes' walk downhill from Razzouk Tattoos, and pilgrims and tourists have gathered here in the small courtyard in front of the entrance to watch one of the many processions of the faithful as they make their way to a service marking the season of Lent. We know from accounts written by pilgrims that this is a scene that would have been familiar going back centuries. Many of those accounts also talk about tattooing. But when did it start?
We have the first evidence in 1563. It was a German knight, Alexander von Pappenheim, who asked an Arab, that's what he said, to mark a cross on his leg.
Dr. Mordecai Levy is a former Israeli diplomat and historian who studied the history of tattooing for 20 years. Christians in the region, like Wasim's family, who are Copts, originating in Egypt, had marked themselves with crosses since the 4th or 5th century. Europeans began arriving in numbers with the Crusades in 1096. The problem with pinpointing the start of the practice is that tattooing techniques hadn't reached medieval Europe, so pilgrims had never seen them before and didn't understand them. We do know, though, that by the 16th century, many Europeans were coming back from the Holy Land with tattoos to mark their pilgrimage. And how that came about is a story of religious politics and commerce that sounds familiar even today, many centuries later.
The pilgrimage was one of the most important income sources for the Franciscan order, and they were trying to get the monopolistic position of taking care of European pilgrims as such. And they have also helpers, which we know as dragomans. Dragomans are actually translators. And the dragoman lived in Bethlehem. That was the hub of the tattoo mastership. And they were not translators, they were also tourist guides.
The dragomans were Arab Christians, and with increasing numbers of rich pilgrims from Europe, they and the Franciscans saw a lucrative business opportunity.
They developed the industry of Christian paraphernalia. This is not only mother pearl and other things which we know out of wood, but also the tattooing. And the client could choose which motive he would like to get tattooed. The first and foremost was, in its popularity, was the Cross of Jerusalem. This is a Greek cross with 4 small crosslets. This was also the emblem of the Franciscan order, the Custodia Terra Santa, which means that they profited from this popularity because this was identified with the Franciscan order.
By this stage, there still wasn't a word in the English language for permanently inking a mark on a person's skin. But the technique was becoming so well known in Europe that they were referred to as Jerusalem marks. The word tattoo didn't arrive until the middle of the 18th century, when Captain Cook brought it back from his voyages in the South Pacific. The parlour's getting really busy now. 24 pilgrims have arrived from Arizona, and almost all of them are getting tattoos. What are you getting done?
I'm going to get a Jerusalem cross.
And you?
I'm going to get Shalom on my wrist.
An olive branch on my wrist.
And what are you having?
I'm getting a stamp of the Nativity because Jesus' birth is the real significance.
I missed you out. What are you having?
I'm getting the word peace in Hebrew and Arabic.
Are you sure?
Yes, I am. And there's a dove.
You better
There's a dove
be
in
sure.
the middle. I couldn't think of what the word was.
Wasim's going to be tied up for a while now, and I want to find out more about the history of the Razzouk family. So I've arranged to meet his 80-year-old father, Anton, who started helping out in the family business when he was only 8. We sat down to talk at his favourite spot, looking down over the city.
We are sitting with the beautiful weather on a hilly area called Mount Zion, where Jesus spent much of his last days. I like it because you can see an important part of Jerusalem from here.
There's a photograph on the wall in the tattoo parlour. It's a man kneeling down, tattooing a woman on a chair in front of him. Tell me about that photograph.
This is the grandfather to my father. Since he didn't have a studio, he used to work like his father by the Holy Sepulchre. And this is how they used to tattoo. There were no electric machines. So he had like a shoe shine man who works on the street.
When would that have been taken, roughly? What year?
It should have been taken probably over 100 years ago.
And that was before the days of electric tattoo machines. So he'd have been using needles tied to a stick as had been used hundreds of years before.
That was the way that even when my father started tattooing, if you were to ask my father, how do you make the ink, Mr. Jacob? He wouldn't tell you, because the ink was his main secret. He used to do the ink like his great-grandfathers, by burning 30 or 40 oil lamps and collecting the soot that comes out from the black burning wick, and take the powder, mix it with non-alcoholic wine, and the color of the ink was very beautiful. Thousands and thousands of people have been tattooed with that kind of ink.
And among them are royalty, including Haile Selassie, the former emperor of Ethiopia, and the British King, Edward VII, who, like so many others who've been tattooed by the Razouks, had a Jerusalem cross on his arm. Back to the parlour.
Marhaba.
Hi, how are you doing?
Do you need a break?
Marhaba.
كيف حالك?
I'm good, thank you.
Carrie Bellinger is a pastor at the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in the old city of Jerusalem. She's lived in the city for 6 years, and this isn't the first time she's visited Wasim.
You know, I've been thinking for a while, I need another one, but actually I want to ask your opinion about placement.
Why have you chosen to express your faith, or part of the expression of your faith is through having tattoos?
Well, first of all, in our baptism liturgy, we say you are sealed by the Holy Spirit and marked with the cross of Christ forever. For me, that's very important. And of course, you don't have to have a tattoo, but it meant a lot to me to think that I put that on my body and said that this is who I am and what I believe, and to make that statement that anyone would see it. And I think that my experience here in Jerusalem as a Christian, as a minority in this context, has made me actually more interested in showing my faith on my body, because there's something about having it on my body that is very powerful for me and reminds me every day when I wake up that this is who I am. You know, we do a lot of things that last forever. So that part of it is not scary to me, the tattooing, the permanency of it, because I think that we every day make decisions that are permanent for other people even in our lives. And more so, I think that it's something that encourages me to think about the everyday acts that I make in life. And we should be thinking about all of them as permanent.
Has it changed your relationship with your faith and with God?
Yes, it's very spiritual for me. It's a faithful thing. It's also just beautiful. This is art that has come down through centuries and through family, through tradition. The one I just got, I was excited to hear him say that it's probably 500 years old. That's so cool to me, to think that there are people for 500 years that have had the same image on their bodies.
Working with pilgrims made me more and more a
deeper and more of a spiritual person, because each time I tattooed a pilgrim, a faithful pilgrim, I absorbed a little bit of their energy and a little bit of their faith. And I did that for 14 years now, and I can feel each time it's still happening. Those stamps have been used to tattoo thousands and thousands of pilgrims for hundreds of years, and you can feel that those stamps have been blessed in a way with the faith of people that they have touched.
Faith and belief have kept Razzouk tattoos alive for centuries. But like so many other businesses in Jerusalem and around the world, the coronavirus has cast a very dark shadow across its future. Since this programme was recorded, for the first time in nearly 700 years, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been closed indefinitely. 14 years ago, Razzouk's faced another existential challenge. Anton Razzouk's eyes were failing. Wasim didn't want to take over, and it looked like centuries of tradition would come to an end. But Wasim had a change of heart, and since then it's gone from strength to strength. We don't know what will happen once this pandemic ends, but one thing is certain. There's a 28th generation Razzouk waiting in the wings. Wasim's son, Anton, who often helps in the shop, learning the trade, just like his ancestors.
Of course, definitely. Me along with my brother, and I do have a younger sister if she also wants. Yeah, I don't see why stopping this tradition would be a good idea, right? It's been going on for 700 years. Why stop now? Am I right?
So the Razzouk tradition is safe?
Definitely it is. It's in safe hands, trust me.
I love what I do, and what makes me love my work even more is the appreciation of people to me and to my work and to what I'm doing.
For Heart and Soul on the BBC World Service, The Tattooist of Jerusalem featured Wasim Razzouk and was produced by me, Phil Peagum.
This is the BBC World Service, where we bring you a twice-daily coronavirus update.
Pandemic.
Social distancing.
State of emergency.
To try and halt the spread of the virus.
As the coronavirus story develops, we're bringing you the very latest.
The government's ratcheted up its response.
A twice-daily roundup of news, information and health advice.
Isolation is absolutely necessary.
The Coronavirus Global Update. Find it at bbcworldservice.com. And at 10:30 GMT, World Football with Manny Jasmy.
This week, one of the brightest coaches in the game, American Jesse Marsh, tells us why he values mentality and emotional connection over tactics. And the Torino defender Ola Aina talks about experiencing lockdown in Turin and London.
The real story is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, this is Ritula Shah with The Real Story. One topic, 1 hour every week. And this week, the coronavirus is spreading in Africa. Will the experience of Ebola help to protect the relatively youthful population? Or will stretched healthcare systems and poverty make it impossible to stop this highly contagious disease from taking lives and destroying communities? Western countries have gone into lockdown, but can people living in small homes in densely populated cities practice social distancing? And how do you stay at home if you depend on a daily wage and have no way to store food? How do you wash your hands when water is in short supply? Should Africans be encouraged to come up with their own bespoke solutions? Can governments afford to support the unemployed? And will Western governments be willing to help when they themselves are in crisis mode? Could the global economic slowdown be more damaging for Africa than the disease itself? That's the real story from the BBC, coming up after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. There's been a broad welcome for the coronavirus emergency package EU finance ministers agreed late on Thursday. The deal will make $500 billion available immediately and set up a recovery fund for use once the crisis is over. Here's our Europe regional editor, Mike Sanders.
It took 16 hours of wrangling, and the putative deal still has to be signed off by EU leaders. But the pledge of huge sums has won praise, some of it effusive. Our faith in Europe has proven correct, tweeted the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli. His fellow Italian, the Finance Minister Roberto Gualtieri, called it an excellent result. But the Corona bonds Italy wanted the EU to issue to share the debt have been killed off by German and Dutch opposition.
A range of new measures is being introduced in the Japanese capital Tokyo to battle rising cases of COVID-19. More from our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow.
Yuriko Koike, the governor of Tokyo, for some weeks has been trying to introduce stricter restrictions. Some places will close down entirely, such as cinemas, internet cafes. Other places, such as bars, will have restricted openings. Bars, for example, will have to stop serving alcohol by 8 p.m. At a press conference held by the Japanese governor, you get a sense of some of the frustration she feels with the central government, which is worried about the effect on the economy.
The South Korean city of Daegu, which was the centre of the country's coronavirus epidemic, has recorded no new cases for the first time since the outbreak began. Nationwide, just 27 new cases were confirmed, the lowest number in 7 weeks. South Korea has begun 2 days of early voting ahead of next week's parliamentary elections. Yemen has reported its first coronavirus case. The emergency committee, run by the internationally recognised government, said the infected patient was in a stable condition and receiving care. Here's Alan Johnston.
The Yemeni government says the coronavirus case was discovered in the eastern region of Hadramaut. Aid workers and many others following events in Yemen have been dreading this confirmation that the virus has arrived in the country. It is desperately poorly placed to fight the disease. More than 5 years of civil war have shattered Yemen's healthcare system. It has nothing like the capacity that may be needed to confront this emergency.
Energy ministers from the G20 group of countries will hold a video conference on Friday to discuss steps to stabilise the oil market. A tentative agreement to reduce production by 10 million barrels a day was agreed by oil exporting countries on Thursday, though Mexico is reluctant to take its share of the cuts. News from the BBC. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is reported to be in good spirits as he recovers from coronavirus. He was moved out of intensive care last night, but his father said there might have to be a period of adjustment before he could return to work. Government figures show Hungary has experienced its largest daily increase in coronavirus cases, with 210 new ones confirmed. Its Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has extended the nationwide lockdown indefinitely using his decree powers. Several MPs in Botswana have been caught breaking their self-isolation instructions and have now been placed in supervised quarantine. On Thursday, all parliamentarians and the President were asked to quarantine for 14 days after a health worker who'd been screening them tested positive. But a government statement said some of the MPs had regrettably been seen shopping in supermarkets. Detainees in Australia's immigration centres are asking the authorities to release them into the community after a case of COVID-19 was confirmed in a facility. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Detainees fear an outbreak of the new coronavirus would be impossible to control inside Australia's immigration centres. They're pleading to be released into the community before it's too late. Some say they're so desperate they've gone on a hunger strike. The government insists there are established plans for dealing with COVID-19 cases within its detention network. A spokesperson says inmates showing symptoms would be quarantined and tested.
An international mission to Mercury is swinging past the Earth on a manoeuvre that should set it on a path towards the inner solar system. The craft is flying past Earth, Venus and Mercury and using their gravity to slow it down. And that's the latest BBC News.
This is The Real Story from the BBC. I'm Rithula Shah with your weekly deep dive into a story that's making news and changing lives. And this week, the contagion and isolation, the shutdowns and job losses caused by coronavirus reach some of the poorest communities on Earth, in Africa.
I, George Manewia, President of the Republic of Liberia, declare a state of emergency.
There shall be cessation of all movement by road, rail, or air.
And I just thought, hey, if these guys are starving, they're at the top of the food chain. The rest of the community is going to be in serious, serious strife.
Some 1.5 million people are now known to have had the virus worldwide. Almost 90,000 have died. Across the globe, governments have enforced lockdowns as the primary weapon in the fight against the virus. But is this a policy that can work in sub-Saharan Africa?
You know, not everybody can afford staying in quarantine for 14 days without going out. Our governments need to be more creative, finding ways to get people to respond to this pandemic, rather than taking first world responses and trying to apply to our conditions.
Should the solutions be tailored to reflect the lives that people actually live? How easy is it to wash your hands when you don't have running water? And in countries already burdened with debt, could the economic consequences be more serious than the disease itself? Are wealthy Africans and wealthy nations willing to help?
We have people in this country who have much. This is the time to come and give to the poor, to the people who survive below $1 a day.
That's really just a window on what we want to talk about today. There's so much to cover because, as we've already seen in Europe, how different countries and populations cope with the crisis can vary significantly. So let me introduce this week's panel. Tolbert G. Inyenswa is Senior Research Associate at Johns Hopkins University, and he's also a former Deputy Minister of Health, Disease Surveillance and Epidemic Control in Liberia, and he was closely involved in the response to Ebola from 2014 to 2016. Carlos Lopez is a professor at the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town and Associate Fellow in the Africa Programme at the think tank Chatham House here in London. And Alex de Waal is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University in the United States and author of the book The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Money, War and the Business of Power. Welcome to you all. Tolbert, if I could ask you to fill us in to begin with, is the virus now officially everywhere in Africa? Where is COVID-19 most prevalent?
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure being with you. We have 10,000 cases of COVID-19, 487 deaths. The case fatality rate is above the rest of the world. 5% deaths have been reported in 52 of the 55 African countries. And what is most striking is that it was in 30 African countries on March 17. And today we're talking about 52 African countries. So this is a huge outbreak we're dealing with.
Carlos Lopez, those statistics suggest it's spreading quite rapidly and the level of fatalities is higher than in other parts of the world. How accurate can we believe those statistics to be?
Not very much. In most countries, we don't know enough about how COVID-19 pandemic is already impacting in terms of infections, in terms of even registering death, because a lot of the deaths are not registered in formal processes. So it's to be taken seriously, like Tolbert said. But on the other hand, we know that this is not accurate and this is not reflecting the true extent of the possible damage already done.
So it could be much worse?
It's certainly much worse.
Alex de Waal, African nations are diverse in terms of their wealth, their population size, the level of urbanisation. So what factors then may be affecting the transmission of the disease?
I think it would be an error to think of this as a single pandemic. Of course, it is a pandemic. It's spread to virtually every country in the world, so far as we know. But in every specific country, and indeed in every specific community, it will have its own dynamics of transmission. So that in a densely settled, low-income urban neighborhood, it will be transmitted very differently to in a high-income suburban neighborhood or a village or a pastoral community or a refugee camp. And it will be spread differently according to people's different livelihoods. So in the African context, we would expect markets, for example, to be one of the main nodes of transmission. And Africa has actually far more experience in responding to epidemics than European countries or the United States. There have been very recent epidemics of Ebola, of measles, of all sorts of communicable diseases. And so I think rather than taking an approach that relies very heavily on the sort of centralized expert approach and saying, this is the data, this is what we know, we can use, as it were, the embedded expertise of African communities and say, how is it likely to be spread in these communities, and how can these communities, what can they tell us about what measures might be effective for containing its spread, rather than just adopting the one-size-fits-all copycat Western approach to this?
Well, that's really interesting, and I hope we can talk about some of that very shortly. Let's hear from Dr. Emmanuel Agogo. He's the Nigeria representative on Resolve to Save Lives, which is an organisation which works to prevent epidemics. He's also one of the founding staff of the Nigerian Centre for Disease Control, and he says the country's best place to deal with the crisis are countries like his, which, as you were just suggesting, Alex, have dealt with large-scale public health crises before.
One of the critical things that we found from the Ebola outbreak and then the review afterwards was the fact that fierce investments that had been made in the country around supporting the country to train epidemiologists, investment in lab systems, where the country was supported to develop systems for diagnosing HIV and TB better, improving surveillance through the investments in the polio response, meant that these resources were easily leveraged to help the country respond to the outbreak of Ebola when it happened in Nigeria. And even during this current outbreak of COVID-19, we're finding that these similar investments have served quite well in the response so far. Another critical thing that happened post-Ebola has been the fact that there's been a push for countries to establish national public health institutes. And these have formed, especially in Nigeria and in similar African countries, the driving force for response, for detecting, for responding, and for preventing outbreaks, which happen all the time in Africa.
That's Emmanuel Ngogo in Nigeria. Talbot, you've got direct experience of the Ebola crisis. How much difference do you think it will make to this pandemic?
I agree with my colleague from Nigeria and other colleagues that talk about the data and what we did in Liberia. I led the incident management system team that brought the outbreak to zero in Liberia, establishing the National Public Health Institute after the Ebola crisis, managing the incident management system team, putting qualified technical Liberians to work, contact tracing, isolation units, and all of that. So it makes countries like Liberia and countries in the West African region, and my colleagues there from Nigeria, better prepared. And on the African continent as a whole, establishing the Africa Center for Disease Control. There are 15 other public health institutes that are established on the African continent, puts us in a better position to dealing with COVID-19.
Is it possible to estimate what the death toll may be like in Africa, Talbot, given what you know about healthcare systems and the population and so on?
What I do know is that if we reach the worst case scenario, it would be catastrophic. To put a number to that at this stage would be very, very difficult until we do what we call the after action review and look at how countries deal with that. And this is why Africa needs to stem up testing, isolation facilities, personal protective equipment, contact tracing, community engagement, social mobilization, and public health measures. These are things that will help Africa as compared to what I see with lockdown cities, curfew, social distancing that the West is doing right now.
You've brought up the question of lockdowns, and I think what I'm going to do is bring in Alcinda Honwana. Alcinda is an anthropologist for the LSE. She grew up in Mozambique and visits there regularly from her home in New York City. And having a foot in two continents and having two homes left her with something of a dilemma.
I was in Mozambique very recently when the United States started closing borders and flights started being canceled. And I remember I was on the last flight on South African Airways that did Johannesburg JFK. I have my family, my husband and my daughters here, but I have my mother, my brothers, and my extended family in Mozambique. And when I left Mozambique, there were no cases in Mozambique, and there were a few cases in New York. It's something that I had to wrestle with. Am I better here? Am I better in New York? But ultimately I decided that my daughters were here, my husband was here, so I flew back to New York. But 2 days ago, I started feeling a little bit of a headache and a sore throat. Then I started being feverish. That's when I decided to isolate myself in a room. And fortunately, I'm 3 days into this, and, nothing has evolved to the worst, so to speak, so far. I know the system in New York is overwhelmed. Even for a first world response, it's a kind of a poor response. But I think in the case of an illness, I am better served here in New York than I would be in Mozambique, with a much weaker healthcare system and issues around care and how people circulate, etc. I think it's more vulnerable there. If you look at the discourse of prevention, it's about social distancing, it's about social isolation, it's about washing your hands, etc. And in New York, that is possible. But in places in Africa, I'll give you a particular example, just not to generalize, but in Mozambique, not everybody can afford social distancing in the same way. Not everybody can afford staying in quarantine for 14 days without going out. People don't have resources to stock groceries for a week. So I think our governments in Africa need to be more creative rather than taking first world responses to the epidemic and trying to apply to our conditions. If we look at public transport and people are in those buses and open air cars kind of hugging each other, what we call the My Loves in Mozambique. And that's the kind of public transport that many Mozambicans take in cities like Maputo. And so it begs a different kind of messaging and articulation. But, if we are creative, that is a way of thinking, not in individualistic terms, but as a collective thing, as a family unit. Isolate your unit from other units. If there is 12 of you in this little household or this little shack, at least you stay together. And if there is an outbreak or there is something there, we can follow this household, we can follow this group. And it also gives the medical practitioners and the healthcare staff a unit to go and act upon. We need to start sending messages that resonate with the conditions that people live in. For example, this is a pandemic that is attacking most seriously elderly people. And we have very young populations in the continent. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have about, latest statistics I saw, it's about 70% of the population was under 30 years of age. Why not empower young people and make young people the drivers of protecting the nation in this time? For example, young people could organize themselves and say, we are going to go out and sell products in the market or buy things, but instead of buying just for myself or my family, we buy for the neighborhood and we distribute and we protect the elderly, and let's put all the elderly together in one place. So, but I don't know what the solution is, but there is some creativity that has to come, and that creativity has to be born out of our own specific conditions.
Anthropologist Alcindor Honwane setting out some of the problems and suggesting one or two solutions. And I should also add, she's feeling a bit better since she recorded that conversation with us. Alex de Waal, you flagged up this question of the lockdown and whether it's an appropriate response for African cities, African countries. Is there, though, a need for governments anywhere, everywhere, to be seen to be doing something?
I think part of the reason for this lockdown is that governments are in some sort of race to establish their credibility internationally by the fierceness of their lockdown. It's as if they don't conform to a particular standard, they're seen as perhaps losing their standing among their peers, or their credit worthiness.
She
And I
recorded
think
that
this is
conversation with
ridiculous.
us.
As
Alex
a
de Bolle, you
number
flagged
of
up this
contributors,
question of the
starting with
lockdown and
Talbot,
whether
have
it's
expressed,
an appropriate response
Africa
for
actually has a
African
lot
cities,
more
African
experience
countries.
in handling deadly epidemics than Europe and the United States.
Is there,
and there
though,
are a
a
lot
need
of
for
interesting
governments
and
anywhere,
creative
everywhere,
ideas,
to be seen to be
as
doing
Alcindor
something?
mentioned. But these will vary from one place to the next. So I think the key formulation ought to be know your local epidemic. I think and discuss it with the communities, because the solutions will not come from sort of the solutions will be worked to establish their credibility internationally, village by village, the fierceness of their lockdown from below. If they don't conform to particular
standards, I think instead of full lockdowns, policymakers need to provide clear guidance on social distancing policies. How can you keep social distancing if you share the toilet with all your neighbors? I believe that most of lockdowns will work for, let's say, a week maximum. I don't think they will work much longer. South Africa has already relaxed a lot of the measures that it has introduced, and this is a more sophisticated urban setting than what you would find in other African countries. Still, there is realization now that when people go too much in a certain direction, thinking that you are doing good, but then you realize that after all, it's not working. Period. And there is just this much you can basically address through repression.
Well, let's think a little bit more about that then, that question of lockdown and how it's enforced. I mean, I think there's 100 countries worldwide now that have either got a full or partial lockdown, so billions of people. Lagos is, of course, by far the biggest city in sub-Saharan Africa, and the man whose job it is to enforce the lockdown there is the CEO of the Lagos State Safety Commission, Lanre Majola.
A lot of people thought that Lagos or Nigeria was isolated from this. But when the numbers started coming up, the federal government decided to shut down the airport. So right now there's no travel in and there's no travel out. The land borders have also been closed. And the mandate has been very clear. We can't have more than 25 people in a place at the same time. So we go out, identify hotspots. We get alerts either through social media or through calls or text messages. And then we go out to these particular places. We're very non-confrontational. We educate them with handbills and flyers, and we speak to them in the three main languages in Nigeria, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba. And then if they're still a bit resistant, then we enforce through a number of non-aggressive ways. For example, at a wedding where they were hesitant, they didn't want to break up the wedding, we went and we switched off the light. At another place, we switched off the music system. We told the DJ to stop playing. And when the power goes, what do? There's a natural tendency to go out onto the streets. And some of the more recent issues that we've been dealing with are people that are congregating on the streets, people that are playing football on the roads, because there's nothing really for them to do inside their houses. Initially, it was a little bit difficult, but I think a lot more people are complying right now. They're understanding the importance of everyone playing their part. Lagos is very unique because it's got the numbers, and it's a mix of the structured and the unstructured, where you have people that need to go out every day to get their food. And if they don't work today, they don't get food tomorrow. But the government has also been very magnanimous. They've identified this as a challenge, and they've been rolling out food feeding programs. So I suppose in this way, it's a bit more unique. It's a bit more different than many other cities like New York. And obviously, we will be able to compare the healthcare system that we have here in Lagos to that of New York. So we now need to go beyond the normal to ensure that we get people separated, we get people distanced from each other, So that's what we've been doing for the past 3 weeks.
That's Lanre Majola, whose job it is to keep 20 million people in Lagos off the streets. Carlos Lopez, he made it sound like it was all quite gentle and quite sort of kind, but we know there have been reported instances of brutality in various places, including South Africa. There is a difficulty of trust and of the enforcers perhaps going too far, isn't there, in this situation?
Well, you cannot quarantine inequality, and this is the moment of truth. This is when people really rebel against whatever exercise of authority that they believe is repressing their basic rights. They may be more accommodating in other circumstances, but in circumstances like this, they just can't afford it. They really are fighting for survival. And it's a very odd choice between a virus that is abstract in a lot of minds and the reality that you need food at the table. And this is what a lot of people are confronted with. Like the first repressive measures in South Africa were in queues of people that were waiting for their social grants. What a choice. If you don't get the social grant, you will not be able to actually provide for your household. On the other hand, you are basically confronted with the situation that if you go to a social grant the same days as everybody else, social distancing becomes a challenge. So it was for the government to organize that upfront, and it didn't.
Alex de Waal, does this situation, in a sense, expose the lack of trust, perhaps, between the people and the state?
I think, indeed, it does. The line between being poor and starving for hundreds of millions of people is a very, very slender one. And if people are not able to be mobile, not able to go to the market, they will very, very quickly, within a matter of days, plunge from being on that borderline of being very poor into facing not only starvation, but also other health problems that follow from that. And one of the key issues in Africa, and this was an issue that was hinted at earlier by Hulbert, is the possibility that the mortality rate might be higher in Africa. And if that's the case, the likely reason would be that COVID-19 is coexisting with other diseases such as malaria, such as tuberculosis, and large numbers of people who have dangerously suppressed immune systems because of HIV. And if we end up exacerbating those other health crises, we could actually also make the COVID-19 morbidity and mortality actually a lot worse. And then, of course, many, many people across the continent will suspect that governments are taking on these emergency powers, primarily not for public health reasons, but because they are also ways of asserting police power, of doing things like suspending or delaying elections, of being able to impose states of emergency and do what they like. So it's quite a combustible mix. And the challenge to African leaders is to proceed in a way that maintains consultation and democratic and builds trust.
Shared between all member states. The governor of Tokyo is asking a range of businesses to close their doors in a bid to halt the spread of the pandemic in Japan. Yuriko Koike has for some time wanted to introduce stricter restrictions than the central government. A first case of the virus has been reported in war-ravaged Yemen. The government said the infected patient is a port worker who's receiving care in the Hadramaut region in the east of the country. Aid groups have been warning that the virus could have a devastating impact on Yemen. Energy ministers from the G group of countries will hold a video conference later to discuss steps to stabilise the oil market. A tentative deal to slash production by 10 million barrels a day was agreed by oil exporters on Thursday, though Mexico is reluctant to take its share of the cuts. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is reported to be in good spirits as he recovers from coronavirus. His father said there might have to be a period of adjustment before the Prime Minister could return to work. Several MPs in Botswana have been caught breaking their self-isolation instructions and have been placed in supervised quarantine. On Thursday, politicians were asked to quarantine for 14 days after a health worker who'd been screening them for the coronavirus herself tested positive. However, some MPs were then seen shopping in supermarkets. BBC News.
You're listening to The Real Story from the BBC World Service with me, Ritula Shah. This week, we're discussing how African countries will cope with the spread of coronavirus. We're joined by Tolbert Nyenswa from Johns Hopkins University. He was closely involved in Liberia's response to Ebola from 2014 to 2016. Carlos Lopez is a professor at the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And Alex de Waal is from Tufts University in the United States, and author of the book The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Money, War and the Business of Power. Now, we've been talking about lockdowns, some of the unique challenges that face African countries in coping with the pandemic generally, but also in this specific circumstance. And effectiveness of the lockdown in an African setting. And we began to touch on the question of food, of what people eat in a situation where they're essentially earning from day to day, where they can't go out and stockpile. They've essentially got to buy the food that they're going to eat on any given day. How does that work? It's something that really impacts on people who live from hand to mouth. And these people have had to turn to food parcels to stave off. And these are residents of Soweto Township in South Africa.
Once this food parcel is finished, and I'm not even sure how long it will last, maybe until the 16th, maybe till the end of the month. But once it's finished, I'll have to go back to begging people for food, because I'm unemployed. But if I had a job, I would have been able to go out and get something.
Things are difficult. I get a social grant for 2 children, but we have to wait now for another social grant payout. Times are really tough, especially if the shutdown carries on. If it wasn't for this parcel, things were going to be really difficult. The kids would cry from hunger, and I wouldn't be able to help them. That would mean we'd just have to starve.
And even in these early days of the crisis, the strain on resources is starting to show. Panyaza Lusufi is a social development official for Gauteng provincial government.
Well, the reality is that we underestimated the number of poor people. We also underestimated the number of homeless people, purely because they're all over. It's very difficult to count them. So initially our planning was that if we can target 20,000 or so of the people to assist us, but the numbers have increased to almost 54,000. So there's an urgent need to support them.
Well, that's a sense of how people are dealing with this in South Africa. Carlos Lopez, does the South African government, the richest, one of the richest in Africa, if it is struggling to cope, what does that tell you about what a lockdown, what the stalling of the economy is likely to mean for people across Africa?
I think it's going to be devastating. It's much more of a problem than people may realize. And in fact, much more deeper consequences will result from the economic impact than from the sanitary dimensions of the crisis. I think we are looking into something like minus 7% points of growth, which will put us into a recession that can go all the way to -5 this year for the continent. If you look into the key engines of growth of the continent, they are all, deeply affected by this crisis, either because the oil prices have collapsed completely for the oil exporting countries. Other commodity prices have also gone down quite considerably. You have 35 countries in Africa that are in the highly commodity dependency category, which means 80% of their exports depend on commodity demand and commodity prices. And this is going to be a devastating year in both counts. But you have also a number of other elements that people talk less, like, for instance, the volatility of the currencies. You have most of the currencies in Africa losing about 30% of their value, which means that their obligations in dollars in terms of debt servicing and others are going up in local currency immensely.
Hold that thought, because I want to come back and just talk about the economy in more detail, but I just want to stay with the specifics that people are experiencing in their everyday lives currently with the lockdown in place. And this question of just food and eating. Alex de Waal, it's one of those things in the UK and in many other parts of the rich world, people stockpiled food. That is not possible in Africa. So how are people going to cope? It seems a mystery to me.
I think people are really going to struggle. People in these circumstances as they turn to their relatives for support. And if turning to relatives for support is essentially prohibited under the lockdown, people go very, very rapidly into a downward economic spiral.
And is this a situation in where rural communities may be better off than urban communities because they may be growing their own food and may live in relatively discrete units?
I think the virus clearly will more slowly in rural areas. And people in rural areas tend to be more resilient to shock, but precisely because they tend to store food or have local reserves or livestock. And actually in the longer term, it's even possible that some of the food producing areas of Africa will benefit insofar as food imports will be curtailed. And so countries that rely on that will be forced to buy more food locally.
And Talbot, something we haven't really talked about is just the nature of the health systems. Ventilators, are they available? How varied are health systems across the continent?
On the continent, there are other countries that have less than 3, 4, 5, 10 ventilators. And to compare with other diseases that will affect people, my colleague Lopez was talking about sub-Saharan African country being disproportionately affected by communicable diseases such as HIV and AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, non-communicable diseases on the rise, for example, cancer, heart attack, coupled with frequent outbreaks of diseases like Ebola, measles. The health system are severely challenged, and yet they have unreliable supply chains and stock essential medication. These things are difficult if you think about forecasting for COVID-19 materials like PPEs, the surgical gloves, disposable gowns, goggles, ventilators. These things are being very, very short supplied.
I want to come back to another kind of really basic piece of advice that everybody's being told, and that is to curb the spread of the virus, you've got to wash your hands. But that's easier said than done for many people. More than 40% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is without a basic water supply. Guy Mbayo is a technical officer for the World Health Organization, and he spoke to us from Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo.
Water is life. You can't live without water. We need water for drinking, for cooking, for cleaning our place, our body, our environment as well. From the structure of the virus, we know that the combination of water and soap, washing our hands, is key to keeping the virus away. 62% of population have access to water and only 38 do not have access. But yet that access is not even when you look at urban settings and rural settings. We have much more challenges in rural settings. Now, when we request people to regularly washing their hands with soap and water, we do understand that there will be a challenge, but yet we are convinced that communicating first the reason why, the benefit that they will derive from it, they can indeed prioritize their water use and be sure to be able to save water for that very important hand washing practice.
That's Guy Mbayo from the WHO. Alex Duval, that seems extraordinary, doesn't it? People who don't have much water anyway are being asked to save it for something that could make the difference between life and death.
That is so striking. It is so compelling. And when we think of communities such as refugees, people in internally displaced camps who are facing all sorts of other crises of access to even the most basic requirements for life, having the threat of COVID-19 and the requirements for basic sanitation on top of that is just extraordinarily challenging.
Before we move on to talk about big economic issues, Talbot, if I can just come back to you with a couple of things that have popped up in the news headlines that people may have noticed. One was a row about vaccines. Now, there is a worldwide race, essentially, to find a vaccine, but there's been a bit of a row in France over a suggestion by one doctor that if a vaccine was found, it should be tested in Africa, and he eventually apologised for his remarks. But what's your reaction to that?
I think the comments are derogatory, unwarranted, and unnecessary. That's number one. Number two, vaccines and therapeutics are essential public health tools. And I know that for sure because the world eradicated smallpox, polio is at a close to being eradicated. So these things are scientific and it's a win-win situation. We should not politicize vaccines and therapeutics trial. And so I'm excited that Dr. Jean Paul was able to apologize for his comments.
I think you pointed out that when Ebola struck, the whole world was behind West Africa and trying to find a solution. This time, if and when a vaccine is found, presumably the whole world will be clamouring for it. How quickly will Africans get access to it?
WHO and Gavi, the Global Fund, should be working very, very closely with pharmaceutical companies that are developing the vaccines to make sure that low, middle income countries have access to them.
So you feel confident that it will be a fair distribution of a resource that will be in high demand?
That's what I anticipate.
Alex de Waal, do you feel confident that Africans will get access to the vaccine if the rest of the world wants it first?
What we have seen up to now is not encouraging. I mean, what we have seen up to now is that in terms of scramble for control of access to essential therapeutic care, ventilators, tests, etc. Even within countries, it's very clear that there's a hierarchy of people who get it first. And some countries have performed very poorly on that, the United States being one. Some have done a bit better, Germany being one of those. What I think this pandemic has shown is the gross inequity in the provision of essential healthcare across the world, the lack of preparedness, the lack of guidelines, or rather, I should say, the willingness of powerful states not only to flout those guidelines, but to try and undermine institutions such as the World Health Organization that are trying in desperate circumstances to uphold them. The politicization of the pandemic, especially by President Trump, is truly scandalous.
We've talked a little bit about the economy already. Carlos has set out some of the challenges that lie ahead. I think joblessness is clearly a big issue that many people around the world, but including in Africa, will face. But I think in African countries, there's much less likely to be a safety net. I think Kenya has established a relief fund, but the majority of countries won't be able to offer or administer anything like that. Let's hear just once more from the anthropologist Alcindor Honwana.
Most governments in Africa will say we don't have resources to support people in times of crisis. But that's when world solidarity has to come forward in the same way like China is sending ventilators or respirators to the United States. You know, Britain and the other nations that have more resources could maybe help support some of those poor nations with safety nets. And that can be distributed through systems that doesn't involve direct exchanges of money using the ICTs. You know, it is quite widespread, those kind of mobile transfers. In poor countries in Africa, people are not used to receiving anything from the government. And so they wouldn't bother to register for anything because they know that all their lives they have been trying to fend for themselves. But if through the corona crisis, there is the subsidy that comes from the government to people, to those who, for example, have a voting card that they registered for voting, those who responded to the national census and they registered, all those who are not, they will know that they need to be, and there are obligations as citizens